If you have stumbled upon this video by chance, please don't click away just yet. The algorithm is still trying to find the right audience for these stories, but I think you found us for a reason. You have discovered a quiet sanctuary in a noisy world. If you are tired of the rush, of the noise, of the endless scrolling, you belong here. This isn't just a story, it's a place to rest. Give yourself a few minutes to settle in. I promise, this is the peaceful escape you didn't know you needed tonight. Good evening and welcome to Embers and Pages, where we retell the world's most beautiful stories in a voice meant for rest. How are you feeling tonight? I hope the day treated you kindly. If it was filled with noise, with demands, with the relentless pace of modern life, you've arrived at a place of quiet. Here we slow down, we breathe, we let stories carry us gently towards sleep. If this is your first time joining us, welcome. You belong here. And if you've returned, thank you for trusting us with your rest once more. Before we begin, a small invitation. If this story brings you comfort tonight, perhaps leave a like, share it with someone who struggles to quiet their mind, or tell us in the comments which classic you'd love to hear next. Your voice matters in this gentle community we're building together. Tonight, we journey to Victorian England, to a time when the country was caught between two worlds, the green, pastoral beauty of the rural south and the thundering machinery of the industrial north. We're entering Elizabeth Gaskell's North and South, published in 1855, a story of transformation, prejudice, and the slow, difficult birth of understanding. This is the tale of Margaret Hale, a young woman forced to leave her beloved Hampshire village for the smoke-darkened mill town of Milton, where she will meet John Thornton, a stern, self-made cotton manufacturer. They will clash like opposing forces, she proud of gentility and tradition, he proud of labor and progress. But through strikes and sorrow, loss and revelation, they will each discover that true respect must be earned, not inherited, and that love sometimes grows in the most unexpected soil. Let's prepare ourselves for rest now. Soften the lights around you or let darkness settle in completely. Turn the volume down low, just loud enough that you must listen carefully, which helps the restless mind grow still. Settle into your bed, let your shoulders drop, release the tension you've been carrying, draw a blanket close. Let your eyes fall shut if they wish. Breathe slowly, in through your nose, out through your mouth. There is nothing you need to do but listen and drift and rest. And please, don't worry if you miss parts of the story. Don't fight if sleep begins to pull you under halfway through a sentence, a scene, a chapter. That is exactly as it should be. This story will wait for you. It will be here tomorrow night and the night after, but tonight your only task is to let go. Our story begins in the soft green countryside of southern England, in a village called Helstone, where Margaret Hale walks through shaded lanes beneath ancient trees, not yet knowing that her peaceful world is about to shatter, that she will soon be uprooted and replanted in foreign soil, among cotton and smoke and fierce, burning ambition. The air is gentle here, the light is golden, but change, as it always does, is already on its way. Margaret Hale had lived in Helstone all her life, and she loved it with the fierce, uncomplicated devotion of someone who has never known another home. The village lay nestled in the Hampshire countryside like a jewel in green velvet. Soft lanes bordered by hedgerows thick with wild roses, fields rolling gently toward distant woodlands, the church tower rising gray and steady against the sky. In summer, the air smelled of honeysuckle and cut grass. In autumn, of wood smoke and damp earth. In every season, it felt like peace itself had taken root there. She knew every path, every cottage, every face. She visited the poor with her mother, bringing soup and comfort and small acts of kindness that were received with gratitude and affection. She walked with her father beneath the ancient oaks, listening to his gentle observations about nature, about faith, about the quiet rhythms of rural life that had remained unchanged for generations. Mr. Hale was the parson of Helstone, a thoughtful, scholarly man who loved his books and his garden and the simple routines of village ministry. Margaret adored him. She adored her mother too, though Mrs. Hale was often absorbed in memories of her own youth, when she had been a beauty in London society, before she married a country clergyman and settled into this quiet, unambitious life that she sometimes regretted, though she tried not to say so. Margaret herself had been away for years, living in London with her aunt and cousin Edith, exposed to the glitter and bustle of fashionable society. But she had never felt at home there. The noise, the artifice, the endless parade of social obligations, It all felt hollow compared to the honest simplicity of Hellstone. The drawing rooms full of people who spoke without saying anything true. The careful dance of manners and appearances. The sense that everyone was performing, always performing, and no one was allowed to simply be. When Edith married a captain and no longer needed her companionship, Margaret returned to her parents with profound relief, as if she had been holding her breath for years and could finally exhale. She was home, she was happy, she was where she belonged. Here in Hellstone, life moved according to the seasons and the church calendar. Spring brought lambs and blossoms. Summer brought long golden evenings and the sound of church bells drifting across the fields. Autumn brought harvest and thanksgiving. Winter brought frost on the windows and fires in the hearth, and the deep, restful quiet of the countryside in repose. Margaret walked these lanes with a sense of rightness, of being exactly where she was meant to be. She had her father's intelligence, her mother's grace, and the settled confidence of someone whose place in the world was clear and unquestioned. But happiness, you understand, is a fragile thing. It grows best in stillness, and the world does not often allow us to remain still for long. It began with small signs, barely noticeable at first. Her father grew quieter than usual, more withdrawn. He would sit in his study for hours, staring at his books without reading them. He took long, solitary walks across the fields and returned with a distant, troubled expression that he tried to hide, but could not quite manage. Margaret noticed, but gently. She did not press him. She assumed it was some minor worry, some passing melancholy that would lift in time, the way fog lifts from the valley when the sun climbs higher. But the fog did not lift. It thickened. Then one evening, after supper, he called her into his study. His face was pale, his hands trembling slightly as he closed the door behind her. He could barely meet her eyes. "Margaret," he said, and his voice cracked on her name like ice breaking. "I must tell you something that will change everything." She sat down slowly, her heart beginning to race, though she did not yet understand why. He told her haltingly, painfully, that he could no longer, in good conscience, remain a clergyman of the Church of England. For months, he had been wrestling with doubts, deep, painful questions about doctrine, about faith, about the very foundations of his beliefs. He had tried to suppress them, tried to pray them away, tried to convince himself they would pass like a fever. But they had only grown stronger, more insistent, until he could no longer ignore them. And now he could no longer stand in the pulpit and preach what he did not fully believe. It would be dishonest. It would be a lie. It would be a betrayal of his own soul and of the people who trusted him to speak truth. Margaret stared at him, her mind struggling to grasp what he was saying. "But, Father, surely you can speak with the bishop, work through these doubts with someone who can guide you." He shook his head, and she saw tears standing in his eyes. "I have tried, Margaret. I have prayed. I have studied. I have wrestled with this until I thought I would go mad. But I cannot change what I feel. I cannot pretend. I must resign my position." The words fell between them like stones into deep water, sinking slowly, creating ripples that spread outward, touching everything. Resign, leave Hellstone. Leave the parsonage, the church, the village, the life they had always known, the only life Margaret had ever wanted. "Where will we go?" Margaret whispered, her voice barely audible. "I don't know yet," he admitted, and the helplessness in his tone made him seem suddenly old, suddenly fragile. "Perhaps to London, or somewhere I can earn a living as a tutor. I have written to some acquaintances. I will find something." "I must." Margaret felt the floor tilting beneath her, felt the walls of the room receding. Everything she loved, everything she had thought solid and permanent and unshakable, was suddenly dissolving like mist in sunlight. Her father's faith had seemed as unchanging as the hills around Hellstone, as certain as the turning of the seasons. And now he was telling her it was gone, or changed, or complicated beyond repair, and they must leave, must abandon everything, must become wanderers instead of rooted, settled people with a place in the world. "When?" she managed to ask, though her throat felt tight. "Soon," he said. "I must resign immediately. It would not be honorable to delay. Every Sunday I stand in that pulpit knowing I do not believe what I am saying. I cannot continue, Margaret, I cannot." She wanted to argue, to beg, to demand that he reconsider, that he find some way to stay. But she could see the anguish in his face, the deep lines of suffering etched around his mouth, the cost this decision had already exacted from him. He was not doing this lightly. He He was not being selfish or impulsive. He was following his conscience, even though it meant losing everything: his position, his home, his security, his identity. And so Margaret, who had been raised to value honesty and integrity above comfort, who had been taught from childhood that principles mattered more than convenience, could not ask him to compromise. She could only nod and try to keep her voice steady, and try not to let him see how completely the ground had just vanished beneath her feet. "We will manage, Father," she said. "Wherever we go, we will manage." But inside, she felt as if a great tree had been uprooted, leaving raw earth and severed roots exposed to the cold air. The days that followed were strange and unreal, like moving through a dream that had turned dark and confusing. They began to pack, to sort through belongings, to decide what could be taken and what must be left behind. Mrs. Hale took the news badly. She wept. She lamented. She spoke bitterly of having married beneath her station for love and now being dragged even lower into poverty and obscurity. Margaret tried to comfort her, tried to keep her own grief private so it would not add to her mother's burden. But at night, alone in her room, she would stand at the window and look out at the moonlit garden, the familiar trees, the landscape she had loved all her life, and feel her heart breaking slowly, slowly, like something freezing and cracking from within. And then word came from Mr. Hale's old Oxford friend, Mr. Bell, who owned property in the north of England. There was a manufacturing town called Milton, in the county of Berkshire, where Mr. Hale could work as a private tutor to gentlemen and their sons who wanted classical education. It was not ideal, but it was respectable, and it would provide an income sufficient to keep them from actual poverty. Milton. The name sounded harsh to Margaret's ears, industrial, foreign. She had never been to the north. She had heard it was grim, dirty, full of factories and smoke and rough, uncivilized people who cared for nothing but money and machinery. But she said nothing. They had no choice. And at least it was employment, at least it was a plan, however unappealing. The day they left Helstone, Margaret walked through the village one last time, alone. She wanted to say goodbye properly to every place that mattered. She walked past the cottages where she had visited the sick and the poor. She walked through the churchyard, touching the old stones, reading names of people who had lived and died in this place for centuries. She walked to the edge of the woods where she and her father had walked so many times, where he had taught her the names of birds and flowers, where they had talked about everything and nothing. She said goodbye to the trees, the lanes, the church where her father had preached for so many years. She said goodbye to the house where she had been a child, to the garden where she had played, to the familiar, beloved landscape that had shaped her into who she was. She did not cry. She held herself very still, very composed. But something inside her was breaking, slowly, steadily, like ice cracking on a frozen pond. When she returned to the house, her parents were waiting with the hired cart that would take them to the station. Her mother's eyes were red from weeping. Her father looked pale and exhausted, as if he had not slept in weeks. They traveled north by train, the rhythm of the wheels a relentless, mechanical drumbeat that seemed to say, "Leaving, leaving, leaving, gone, gone, gone." Margaret watched the countryside change outside the window. The soft green hills gave way to harder, darker terrain. The stone changed from warm golden to cold gray. The air grew heavier, tinged with soot and smoke. And when they finally arrived in Milton, stepping out into the smoky, clamorous station, surrounded by noise and crowds and the overwhelming smell of coal, Margaret felt as if she had been transported to another country entirely, another world that operated by rules she did not understand. This was not England as she knew it. This was something new, something raw and loud and unforgiving, something that did not care about beauty or tradition or the gentle rhythms she had always lived by. She lifted her chin, straightened her shoulders, and followed her parents through the crowded streets toward the lodging house where they would stay until they found something permanent. But in her heart, she was still standing in Helstone, beneath the trees, saying goodbye to everything she had ever loved. Milton was a shock to every sense Margaret possessed. The town revealed itself gradually as their hired carriage rattled through the outskirts. First the smell, acrid and metallic, a mix of coal smoke and chemicals that caught in the throat. Then the sound, a constant low roar punctuated by the clang of machinery, the shouts of workers, the rumble of carts laden with cotton bales. And finally the sight. Row upon row of blackened brick buildings, narrow streets crowded with people moving with grim purpose, and rising above it all, the mill chimneys, dozens of them, belching dark smoke into a sky that seemed permanently grey. This was industry, this was progress. This was the future of England, or so people said. To Margaret, it looked like hell. Their lodgings were in a respectable part of town, but even there, the soot settled on windowsills within hours of cleaning, and the air tasted of ash. The house itself was decent, clean, adequately furnished, managed by a landlady who was efficient if not warm. But it was not home. It could never be home. The rooms felt cramped after the spacious parsonage at Helstone. The windows looked out not on gardens and fields, but on other brick houses, other windows, other lives pressed close together. Mrs. Hale took to her bed almost immediately, claiming the journey had exhausted her, though Margaret suspected it was more the reality of their new situation that had drained her strength. Her mother had always been delicate, prone to headaches and nervous complaints, but here in Milton, surrounded by smoke and noise and the constant reminder of their reduced circumstances, she seemed to wilt like a flower torn up by the roots. Mr. Hale tried to be optimistic. He had already made contact with several families who wanted tutoring for their sons, manufacturers, mostly, men who had made fortunes in cotton and now wanted their children to have the classical education they themselves had missed. It was honest work, he said. It would sustain them. They would adapt. But Margaret could see the effort it cost him to smile, to speak hopefully, to pretend that everything would be all right. She tried to help. She tried to make their new house feel like a home, arranging their familiar belongings in unfamiliar rooms, hanging the pictures her mother loved, setting out her father's books. She tried to encourage her mother to get out of bed, to take an interest in their new life. She tried to walk through Milton streets without flinching at the dirt and the crowds and the overwhelming foreignness of it all. But everything about this place grated against her. The people spoke differently, their accents harsh and clipped. The women dressed plainly, practically, without the gentility she was used to. Even the light was different, filtered through smoke. It had a strange, yellow quality that made everything look sickly and unreal. And then she met John Thornton. It happened on one of her father's first days of tutoring. Mr. Thornton was a manufacturer, the owner of Marlborough Mills, one of the largest cotton operations in Milton. He was a self-made man, her father explained, someone who had risen from near poverty through intelligence, discipline, and sheer force of will. He wanted to improve his education, to study the classics he had never had time for as a young man fighting his way up from nothing. Mr. Hale was to be his tutor. Margaret happened to be in the sitting room when Mr. Thornton arrived for his first lesson. She heard his voice in the hall, deep, firm, with the flat northern accent that still jarred her southern-bred ear. When he entered the room, she looked up, and their eyes met for the first time. He was perhaps 30, tall and broad-shouldered, with a face that was not handsome in any conventional sense, but striking nonetheless. Strong features, a square jaw, dark eyes that seemed to look right through pretense to the truth beneath. He was dressed well but plainly, in the dark suit of a businessman, with none of the elegance or ease of a gentleman born. Everything about him spoke of discipline, control, purpose. He bowed slightly to her. "Miss Hale, I presume, Mr. Thornton." She inclined her head with cool politeness. She saw him notice her coolness, saw something flicker in his expression, surprise, perhaps, or assessment. He was used to being respected in Milton, she realized, probably even feared. He was not used to a young woman looking at him with barely concealed disdain. But Margaret could not help it. She knew what he was, a tradesman, a manufacturer, someone who made his living from machinery and labor and commerce. In Helstone, such a man would have been beneath the notice of a parson's daughter. In London, he would not have been received in polite society at all. The fact that her father was now employed by such a man, dependent on him for income, was just another humiliation added to all the others. Mr. Thornton turned to her father, and they disappeared into the study for the lesson. But Margaret felt unsettled for the rest of the day, as if that brief encounter had shifted something in the air around her. Over the following weeks, Mr. Thornton came regularly for his lessons. Margaret usually managed to avoid him, keeping to other parts of the house during his visits. But sometimes they would cross paths, in the hall, on the stairs, once in the street when she was returning from a walk and he was arriving for his appointment. Each time, they exchanged brief, polite words and nothing more. But Margaret was always aware of him, of the way he carried himself with such assurance, such unshakable confidence in his own worth. Her father spoke of him with genuine respect. Mr. Thornton, he said, had a fine mind, a quick understanding of classical texts, and a seriousness of purpose that was admirable. He was not educated in the traditional sense, but he was intelligent, thoughtful, and eager to learn. Mr. Hale seemed to genuinely like him. Margaret could not understand it. To her, Mr. Thornton represented everything she disliked about Milton: the worship of money and industry, the harsh utilitarianism that valued profit over beauty, the arrogant pride of men who thought they had made themselves and owed nothing to tradition or culture or the gentle values of the past. One evening, her father invited Mr. Thornton to stay for tea after the lesson. Margaret, cornered by politeness, had no choice but to join them. They sat in the modest parlor, and conversation turned, inevitably, to Milton and its industries. "You must find our town very different from your previous home, Miss Hale," Mr. Thornton said, his tone neutral but his eyes watchful. "Very different," Margaret agreed. Hellstone was peaceful, beautiful, a place where people lived according to older, gentler rhythms. "And you find Milton ugly," he said bluntly. She met his gaze. "I find it harsh, unforgiving, a place where everything is sacrificed to industry and profit. And yet it is industry that feeds thousands of families," he replied, his voice still calm but with an edge now. "It is profit that creates employment, wealth, progress. Would you prefer people to starve picturesquely in the countryside rather than work in mills?" "I would prefer," Margaret said coldly, "that workers be treated as human beings, not as machines to be used and discarded." His jaw tightened. "I treat my workers fairly, Miss Hale. I pay them what their labor is worth. I expect discipline and hard work, and I provide employment in return. That is the contract." "A contract where you hold all the power and they hold none," she countered. Mr. Hale interrupted gently, trying to smooth over the tension. "Margaret, Mr. Thornton has been explaining to me the complexities of the cotton trade. It is not as simple as it might appear from outside." But Margaret was not ready to back down. "Perhaps not, but I have walked through the streets here, Mr. Thornton. I have seen the workers' houses, the children with bare feet, the women bent from labor. Is that the progress you speak of so proudly?" For a moment, Mr. Thornton's expression was thunderous, and Margaret thought he might lose his temper entirely. But he mastered himself, stood, and bowed with rigid formality. "I see we disagree fundamentally, Miss Hale. I thank you for your hospitality, Mr. Hale. I will see you next week for our lesson." He left, and the room felt suddenly larger and quieter in his absence. Mr. Hale sighed. "Margaret, you were rather severe with him." "He is severe with his workers," she replied. "He deserves no better." But later, alone in her room, Margaret found herself thinking about the encounter, about the way Thornton's eyes had flashed with anger, but also perhaps with hurt. As if her judgment of him mattered, as if he had expected better from her, she pushed the thought away. He was a mill owner, a man who profited from the suffering of others. She had been right to challenge him. She had been right to let him know exactly what she thought of him and his world. But still, she could not quite forget the look in his eyes when she had spoken of workers being treated as human beings. As if, for just a moment, her words had struck something deeper than his pride. Milton, she thought, was a terrible place, and the people here, proud, harsh, unyielding, were as unforgiving as the landscape of smoke and stone. She wanted nothing more than to leave, but there was nowhere to go. This was their life now, and somehow she would have to find a way to bear it. As the weeks passed, Margaret began, reluctantly, to understand Milton a little better. Not to love it, she did not think she could ever love this place of smoke and stone, but to see it more clearly, to grasp the workings of the world it represented. Her father continued his lessons with Mr. Thornton and with other pupils, sons of manufacturers who wanted the classical education their fathers had lacked. Mr. Hale seemed to find satisfaction in the work, in returning to the scholarship he loved. And gradually, through his conversation, Margaret learned about the cotton trade, about the machinery that turned raw fiber into fabric, about the markets and fluctuations and economic forces that governed the lives of everyone in Milton. It was a world run by iron laws, it seemed. Supply and demand, profit and loss, competition so fierce that a single miscalculation could ruin a man. The masters, the mill owners, were locked in constant struggle, not just with their workers but with each other and with the unpredictable forces of international trade. When cotton prices fell or when markets contracted, the masters reduced wages to survive. When workers objected, they were told there was no choice. The alternative was the mill closing entirely, and then everyone would starve. Margaret found it all brutally cold, this reduction of human life to economic calculation. But she could not deny that there was a terrible logic to it. One day, while walking through the streets near the workers' districts, Margaret encountered a young woman about her own age, hollow-eyed and pale, leaning against a wall and coughing with a deep, rattling sound that spoke of illness lodged in the lungs. Margaret stopped, concerned. "Are you all right?" she asked gently. The woman looked at her with mild surprise, clearly not used to being addressed by someone dressed as well as Margaret. "Aye, miss, just the cotton lung. We all get it working in the mills. Cotton lung, from the fluff, the air in the carding room, it's thick with it. You breathe it in all day, every day. Eventually it settles in your chest and, well," she coughed again, a harsh, painful sound. Margaret felt a chill run through her. "Can nothing be done?" The woman shrugged, as if the question were naive. "It's the work, miss. We need the work, cotton lung or no." Margaret wanted to say something, to offer help, but what could she offer? She had no money, no power. So she simply stood there, helpless, as the woman pushed off from the wall and walked away, disappearing into the crowded street. That evening, Margaret spoke to her father about it. He sighed and nodded. "Mr. Thornton has mentioned the same thing. He says the workers accept the risks because the alternative is unemployment and starvation. It is tragic, but in his view, it is simply the nature of industry." "How can he speak so calmly about people destroying their health?" Margaret demanded. "Does he feel nothing?" "I think he feels a great deal," Mr. Hale said quietly. "But he believes that sentiment cannot govern business, that if he ran his mill based on compassion rather than economic necessity, he would soon be bankrupt, and then his workers would have nothing at all." Margaret was not satisfied with this answer, but she had no alternative to offer. She was learning, slowly and painfully, that the world was more complicated than she had believed when she lived in Hellstone, where poverty was a matter of individual misfortune, not systemic structure. Determined to understand the workers' lives better, Margaret began to visit the poorer districts of Milton more regularly. She brought what little she could, soup, bread, small comforts, and she listened. She listened to women talk about their children working 12-hour days in the mills. She listened to men describe the constant fear of wage cuts, of being replaced by younger, cheaper labor. She listened to stories of injury, of illness, of exhaustion so deep it became a permanent state of being. And through these visits, she became friends with a man named Nicholas Higgins and his daughter Bessie. Higgins was a cotton worker, skilled and proud, a man in his 40s with a weathered face and intelligent eyes. He was involved in the union, the workers' organization that tried to negotiate with the masters for better wages and conditions. He spoke bluntly, without deference, and Margaret found she respected his honesty even when she disagreed with his views. His daughter Bessie was perhaps 20, but looked older, her face gray with illness. She had the cotton lung, like so many others, and it was consuming her slowly but relentlessly. She could no longer work, and spent her days sitting by the window, coughing and struggling for breath. But despite her suffering, she was gentle and kind, with a deep religious faith that gave her comfort even as her body failed. Margaret visited them often. She sat with Bessie, reading to her from the Bible or just talking quietly. She debated with Higgins about masters and workers, about rights and responsibilities, about the future of England's industrial system. He challenged her assumptions, forced her to think more deeply, to question the easy judgments she had made when she first arrived in Milton. "You gentry folk," Higgins said to her once, "you think we should be grateful for whatever the masters give us. But Miss Hale, we're not children to be given charity. We're men who work hard and deserve fair pay for our labor. The masters grow rich off our sweat, and when times are bad, they cut our wages while keeping their own comforts. Is that justice? But Mr. Thornton says the masters are bound by economic forces they cannot control," Margaret replied. "That if they pay more than the market dictates, they will be undercut by competitors and forced to close." "Aye, that's what they say," Higgins said with a bitter smile. "But I notice they never seem to go hungry themselves, even when they're cutting our wages. I notice they never breathe the cotton dust that kills my Bessie. I notice they make the decisions and we bear the consequences." Margaret had no answer. She was beginning to see that both sides spoke some truth and that the real problem was the system itself, which pitted worker against master in a struggle neither could fully win. One afternoon, she encountered Mr. Thornton himself while leaving the Higgins house. He was walking through the district, inspecting something or conducting some business, and he stopped when he saw her emerging from the modest home. "Miss Hale," he said, his tone neutral but his eyes surprised. "You are visiting in this neighborhood." "I have friends here," she said, lifting her chin slightly, daring him to criticize. "Friends among the workers." He seemed genuinely taken aback. "Is that so strange? They are people, Mr. Thornton, human beings with thoughts and feelings and dignity." "I am aware of that, Miss Hale," he said, and there was an edge to his voice now. "I employ hundreds of them. I know them better than you might think." "Do you?" she challenged. "Do you know what it is like to breathe cotton dust until your lungs fail? Do you know what it is like to fear starvation every time wages are cut? Do you know their lives or only their labor?" His jaw tightened, and she saw anger flash in his eyes. But also something else, something that might have been hurt, or frustration, or the realization that she would never think well of him no matter what he said. "I provide employment, Miss Hale," he said, his voice hard. "In a world where many have none. I run my mill according to principles of justice and discipline. I do not sentimentalize the relationship between master and worker, but neither do I exploit. I give fair value for fair work, and when times are hard, you cut their wages while keeping your own wealth intact. When times are hard, I do what is necessary to keep the mill running so there are jobs at all. If I did not, the mill would close, and every one of those workers would be unemployed. Is that what you would prefer?" They stood facing each other in the grimy street, two people from different worlds, each convinced of their own rightness, each unable to make the other understand. Finally, Thornton said more quietly, "I do not expect you to approve of me, Miss Hale, but I would ask you not to judge what you do not fully comprehend." "I comprehend suffering well enough, Mr. Thornton," she replied. "I see it every time I visit this neighborhood." He looked at her for a long moment, and something in his expression shifted, a kind of weariness or perhaps sadness. Then he bowed slightly and walked away, his broad shoulders straight, his stride purposeful. Margaret watched him go, feeling oddly unsettled. She had won the argument, or at least had the last word, but it felt hollow. Because beneath the clash of ideas, beneath the conflict of their worldviews, there had been something else in the air between them. Something she did not want to name or acknowledge. "Back in the Higgins home," Bessie asked, "was that Mr. Thornton you were speaking with, Miss Hale?" "Yes. He's a hard master," Bessie said, "but they say he's fair. Harder on himself than on anyone else, my father says." "Does he?" Margaret said, more sharply than she intended. Bessie smiled faintly. "You don't like him, do you, miss?" "I don't like what he represents," Margaret said. "The coldness, the reduction of people to economic units." "Aye," Bessie said, "but he's not a bad man for all that. My father says he's got principles, more than most masters around here." Margaret did not reply. She did not want to think about John Thornton having principles, or depth, or anything beyond the harsh industrial philosophy he seemed to embody. It was easier to see him as the enemy, the symbol of everything wrong with Milton. But increasingly, she suspected, he was more complicated than that, and so, perhaps, was she. The divisions in Milton ran deep, between masters and workers, between North and South, between different visions of what England should become. And Margaret found herself caught in the middle, belonging nowhere, understanding more than she wanted to, feeling her certainties begin to crack and shift like ice in spring. Despite their differences, or perhaps because of them, Margaret Hale and John Thornton continued to orbit each other, drawn together by circumstance and her father's weekly lessons, repelled by fundamental disagreements about the world. Thornton came to the Hale house every week for his classical studies, and increasingly, he lingered afterward for tea or conversation. Mr. Hale enjoyed his company and encouraged him to stay. Margaret was usually present, and though she tried to maintain a cool distance, she found it difficult to ignore a man so forceful, so utterly certain of himself. What Margaret did not know, what she could not have guessed, was that John Thornton was falling in love with her. It had begun almost from their first meeting, when she had looked at him with such cool disdain, and he had felt, for the first time in years, uncertain of himself. He was used to respect in Milton, even fear. He was a powerful man, successful, disciplined, admired for having risen from poverty through sheer determination. Women treated him with deference, or with the calculating interest of those seeking a wealthy husband. But Margaret looked at him as if he were beneath her notice, as if all his accomplishments meant nothing because he lacked breeding, because he worked in trade, because he was not a gentleman. And instead of angering him, though it did anger him, it also fascinated him. She was so different from anyone he had ever known. Beautiful, yes, with her dark eyes and graceful bearing, but that was not what captivated him. It was her mind, her passion, her unwillingness to flatter or dissemble. She said exactly what she thought, challenged him openly, refused to be impressed by wealth or power. She had principles and she defended them fiercely. She cared about people, about ideas, about things beyond money and success. She reminded him painfully of what he had sacrificed in his climb upward from poverty: beauty, leisure, the kind of education and cultivation that could only come from a life not consumed by the need to survive and succeed. She represented a world he could never fully enter, no matter how much money he made. And that made her both unbearably desirable and unbearably distant. He tried to hide his feelings. He was not a man prone to sentiment or emotional display. But when Margaret was in the room, he was acutely aware of her, where she sat, what she said, how she moved. When she argued with him, he felt more alive than he did in any business negotiation. When she looked at him with disapproval, it stung more than he wanted to admit. Margaret, meanwhile, remained oblivious to his feelings. She saw only the stern mill owner, the embodiment of northern industrial harshness. If anything, his continued presence in their home irritated her. He seemed so arrogant, so convinced of his own rightness, so blind to the human cost of his economic philosophy. And yet, despite herself, she sometimes found her thoughts returning to their conversations. He was intelligent, she had to admit. When they debated, he did not patronize her or dismiss her arguments because she was a woman. He engaged with her seriously, forcefully, as if her opinion mattered. There were moments, brief, fleeting, when she almost liked him. But then he would say something about the workers accepting their lot, or about sentiment having no place in business, and her dislike would return, stronger than before. One evening, the Hales held a small gathering, a modest attempt to establish some social life in Milton. Mr. Thornton was invited, along with a few other acquaintances. The conversation turned, inevitably, to the cotton trade and the growing tensions between masters and workers. "There is talk of a strike," said one of the guests, another manufacturer. "The workers are demanding we maintain wages, even though the market has contracted. It's economically impossible. Then they will learn the consequences of unreasonable demands," Thornton said calmly. "A strike will hurt them far more than it hurts us. They will exhaust their savings in a few weeks and be forced to return to work on whatever terms we offer." Margaret, who had been listening in growing indignation, could not keep silent. "And you speak of this as if it were a simple game of strategy, Mr. Thornton. What about the children who will go hungry during those weeks? What about the families who will be evicted from their homes?" Thornton turned to her, his expression hardening. "I speak of economic reality, Miss Hale. I did not create the laws of supply and demand. I merely operate within them, as every master must." "But you benefit from those laws while the workers suffer under them," she said. "You sleep in comfort while they wonder how to feed their children." "I worked 16-hour days when I was younger than many of those workers," Thornton said, his voice tight with suppressed emotion. "I went without meals so my mother and sister could eat. I built my mill from nothing through labor and sacrifice. I understand hardship better than you might imagine, Miss Hale, who have lived all your life in genteel comfort." Margaret flushed. "Genteel comfort? My father gave up his position, his home, everything for the sake of his conscience. We have known loss too, Mr. Thornton. Loss of status," he said. "Not starvation, not the workhouse. Not the kind of poverty that grinds people into dust." They were facing each other now, the rest of the room forgotten, the other guests watching with uncomfortable fascination. "Perhaps not," Margaret said, her voice shaking slightly. "But at least we have not grown hard and cold from our struggles. At least we still feel compassion for those less fortunate." Compassion, Thornton said, and there was bitterness in his tone now, is a luxury of those who do not bear responsibility for hundreds of livelihoods. I cannot afford to be soft, Miss Hale. If I am hard, it is because the world is hard, and those who govern themselves by sentiment rather than reason do not survive in it. Then I pity you, Margaret said quietly. For all your success, if you have lost the ability to feel, you are poorer than the workers you employ. For a moment, something flickered in Thornton's eyes, pain, perhaps, or recognition. He opened his mouth as if to respond, then closed it again. He looked at her with an expression of such intensity that Margaret felt her breath catch. Then he bowed stiffly to Mr. Hale and made his excuses. He left the gathering early, and the remaining guests departed soon after, the evening clearly spoiled by the confrontation. Mr. Hale sighed after everyone had gone. Margaret, you were very severe with Mr. Thornton. He is a good man, despite his rough manner. He is a hard man, Margaret said. And yes, I was severe, because someone must speak for those who have no voice. But later, alone in her room, Margaret felt troubled. She kept remembering the look in Thornton's eyes when she had said she pitied him. It had not been the look of a man who felt nothing. It had been the look of a man who felt too much and had learned to bury it deep, where it could not interfere with survival. She pushed the thought away. She did not want to sympathize with John Thornton. She did not want to see him as human, as complicated, as anything other than the symbol of industrial coldness she needed him to be. Meanwhile, Thornton walked back to his large, successful, empty house and sat alone in his study, staring into the fire. Margaret's words echoed in his mind. I pity you. If you have lost the ability to feel, you are poorer than the workers you employ. She was wrong. He felt everything, perhaps too much. He felt the weight of responsibility for every worker in his mill. He felt the constant anxiety of competition, market fluctuations, the razor's edge between success and ruin. He felt the pressure to be strong, disciplined, never weak, never uncertain. And he felt, God help him, the overwhelming, impossible attraction to a woman who looked at him with contempt, who saw only his hardness and never his heart. He had worked all his life to build something, to rise above the poverty and desperation of his youth. He had made himself into a man of substance, of respect, of power. But he could not make Margaret Hale respect him. He could not make her see him as anything other than a crude tradesman, unworthy of her regard. It should not have mattered. She was just one woman, just one person's opinion. But it mattered more than anything else in his carefully constructed life. In the weeks that followed, the tension in Milton grew worse. The workers were indeed preparing to strike. Thornton and the other masters prepared to stand firm, to refuse any wage concessions. Nicholas Higgins spoke passionately to Margaret about the justice of the workers' cause, about their right to fair treatment. And Margaret found herself caught in the middle, seeing the validity in both positions, understanding both the workers' desperation and the masters' economic constraints, and powerless to bridge the gap between them. She saw less of Thornton during this period. He was consumed with mill business, and when he did come for his lessons, he was formal, distant, as if he had decided to maintain a strict separation between them. Margaret told herself she was relieved, but she found she missed their arguments, missed the fierce engagement of their debates, missed even the discomfort of being challenged and forced to defend her views. Milton was heading toward crisis. The strike was coming, and Margaret, without fully realizing it, was being drawn deeper into the conflict and deeper into a connection with John Thornton that neither of them wanted and neither could prevent. The strike came like a storm that had been building on the horizon for weeks, inevitable and terrible. The workers of Milton, united through their union, made their demand. The masters must not cut wages, despite the downturn in the cotton market. They argued that they were already living on the edge of starvation, that any reduction would push them over into absolute destitution. The masters, including Thornton, refused. They argued that economic reality left them no choice. If they paid more than the market supported, they would be undercut by competitors and forced out of business entirely. Neither side would yield, and so the workers, following a vote organized by Nicholas Higgins and other union leaders, decided to strike. Across Milton, thousands of workers stopped showing up to the mills. The great machines fell silent. The chimneys stopped smoking. The town, usually roaring with industrial noise, became eerily quiet. At first, there was a strange, almost festive atmosphere among the workers. They gathered in groups, talking, organizing, convinced that the masters would quickly cave to their demands. How could the mills run without workers? Surely the masters would see reason. But the masters did not see reason. Or rather, they saw a different reason. The reason of men who had fought their way up from nothing and would not be dictated to by workers they considered employees, not partners. Thornton, especially, was immovable. He had weathered strikes before. He knew that the workers' savings would not last long, that hunger and desperation would eventually force them back on the master's terms. It was simply a matter of waiting them out. Margaret watched it all with growing horror. She visited the Higgins household regularly and saw how quickly the initial optimism faded. Within a week, families were running out of food. Children cried from hunger. The union tried to distribute what resources they had, but it was never enough. Some workers, desperate, began to look for any kind of work, any way to feed their families. Others held firm, convinced that if they could just endure a little longer, the masters would have to give in. Nicholas Higgins remained defiant. "We're not animals, Miss Hale," he said to Margaret one afternoon, his face gaunt from missed meals. "We're men, we have a right to fair wages for our labor. If we give in now, the masters will know they can starve us into submission any time they want. We have to stand firm." "But your daughter," Margaret said gently, glancing at Bessie, who was thinner than ever, her breathing labored. "She needs food, medicine. Can you afford to continue?" "Can I afford not to?" Higgins said. "If I go back now on their terms, what kind of future does Bessie have? What kind of world are we leaving for our children if we teach them to bow and scrape and accept whatever crumbs the masters throw us?" Margaret had no answer. She understood his pride, his refusal to be broken. But she also saw the suffering, the children with hollow eyes, the mothers quietly weeping as they tried to make watery soup stretch for another meal. She tried to speak to her father about it, tried to see if there was any way to mediate, to bring the two sides together. But Mr. Hale, though sympathetic, was helpless. He had no influence with the mill owners, and the workers would not listen to someone they saw as allied with the masters. Meanwhile, the tension in Milton grew day by day. The workers, hungry and desperate, grew angrier. The masters, determined not to yield, grew more rigid. And Margaret felt the town itself becoming a powder keg, waiting for a spark. Thornton came less frequently to the house during this period, consumed with managing the crisis at his mill. When he did come, he was grimmer than ever, his face set in hard lines, his manner curt. Margaret found herself watching him and wondering what he was thinking, what he was feeling beneath that iron self-control. Did he feel nothing for the suffering workers, or did he feel it too much and could not afford to let it show? One afternoon, Margaret was walking back from the Higgins house when she saw a crowd gathering near Marlborough Mills, Thornton's factory. Her heart began to race. She knew immediately that something was wrong. The crowd was too large, too agitated, moving with the dangerous energy of people who have been pushed too far. She should have gone home. She should have walked in the other direction. But something drew her forward, some need to see, to understand, to be present even if she could do nothing. The crowd was made up of striking workers and their families, and as Margaret drew closer, she could hear them shouting. They were angry about Irish workers, outsiders that Thornton had apparently brought in to replace the strikers, to keep his mill running. This was seen as the ultimate betrayal, proof that the master cared nothing for his own workers, that he would replace them without a second thought. The mood was ugly, violent. Margaret saw men with stones in their hands, saw women shouting curses, saw the crowd pressing closer to the mill gates. She caught sight of Nicholas Higgins in the throng, his face torn between anger at Thornton's actions and fear of where this was heading. Then she saw Thornton himself, standing at an upper window of the mill, looking down at the crowd without flinching. Even from a distance, she could see his expression, stern, unyielding, ready to face whatever came. He would not back down. He would not show fear. He would stand there and take the consequences of his decision. The crowd grew louder, more threatening. Someone threw a stone. It hit the building with a crack that sounded like a gunshot. Then another stone and another. The violence was escalating rapidly, and Margaret realized with cold certainty that people were going to be hurt, possibly killed. She looked around desperately for someone to intervene, for the authorities, for anyone with the power to stop this. But there was no one, just the crowd and Thornton, facing each other like opposing armies. And Margaret, caught between them, feeling the terrible inevitability of what was about to happen. The storm had been building for weeks, and now it was breaking, and there would be no stopping it until it had run its course. She could only watch, helpless, as Milton tore itself apart. Thornton stood at the window, his heart pounding but his face impassive. He had known this might happen. He had made his decision knowing the risks. He would not bend, he could not. If he gave in to intimidation, if he let the workers dictate terms through violence, then every mill owner in Milton would face the same tactics. Order would collapse, discipline would be lost. The entire industrial system that supported thousands of livelihoods would crumble. But standing there, looking down at the angry faces, faces of men he employed, men who had worked for him for years, men whose names he knew, he felt something twist in his chest. This was not what he wanted. He did not want to be hated. He did not want to be seen as the enemy by people he provided for, people he considered himself responsible for in his own way. But sentiment, he reminded himself harshly, had no place in business. He had learned that lesson young, learned it through hunger and hardship and the failure of his father, who had been too soft, too generous, and had ruined himself and his family through kindness. Thornton would not repeat those mistakes. He would be hard. He would be disciplined. He would survive. Even if it meant standing alone against a mob, even if it meant being hated, even if it meant Margaret Hale looking at him with disgust and thinking him a monster. The thought of Margaret pierced him more deeply than he wanted to admit. He wondered where she was, what she was doing, whether she knew what was happening, whether she was thinking of him at all, or whether she simply heard about the riot later and nodded, unsurprised, convinced that this was exactly what happened when a man like him put profit above people. Below, the crowd's anger reached a crescendo. More stones flew. The mill gates shuddered under pressure. And Thornton stood firm, waiting for whatever would come, alone in his certainty, isolated in his principles, knowing he was right but wondering for just a moment whether being right was worth the cost of being so utterly, completely alone. The moment hung suspended like a breath before a scream. Margaret stood at the edge of the crowd, her heart pounding, watching the violence escalate. More stones flew through the air. The mill gates rattled under the pressure of bodies pushing forward. Men were shouting, their voices raw with rage and desperation. Women screamed encouragement or warnings. Children watched with wide, frightened eyes. And Thornton stood at the window, alone, visible to everyone, refusing to retreat or hide. Margaret saw it happening as if in slow motion, the mood of the crowd shifting from anger to something darker, more dangerous. They were no longer just shouting. They were advancing. They wanted blood. They wanted to break down the gates, to storm the mill, to punish the man who they believed had betrayed them by bringing in outside workers while they and their families starved. She looked around desperately for help. Where were the authorities? Where were the police? But there was no one, just the crowd and Thornton and the terrible inevitability of violence. Then she saw the gates beginning to give way. The crowd surged forward with a roar of triumph. And Margaret knew, with absolute certainty, that if they reached Thornton, they would kill him. Not because they were evil, but because they were desperate, hungry, beyond reason. Because a mob has no conscience, no restraint, no mercy. Without thinking, acting on pure instinct, Margaret began pushing through the crowd. People shouted at her, tried to block her way, but she forced through, driven by a single overwhelming need. To stop this, to prevent murder, to somehow stand between the mob and the man they wanted to destroy. She did not ask herself why. She did not question the urgency that drove her. She only knew that she could not stand by and watch John Thornton be torn apart by an angry crowd. No matter how much she disagreed with him, no matter how much she condemned his harshness. She reached the mill gates just as they burst open. The crowd poured into the courtyard. She ran ahead of them, ran toward the mill entrance, her skirts tangling around her legs, her breath coming in sharp gasps. She could hear the crowd behind her like thunder, feel their rage like heat at her back. Thornton appeared at the door, stepping out to face the mob. His face was pale but set, his jaw clenched. He was going to meet them head-on, was going to stand his ground even if it meant dying. The stubborn, prideful fool was going to let himself be killed rather than retreat. Margaret reached him just as the first workers surged forward. She put herself in front of him, threw her arms wide as if she could shield him with her own body. "Stop!" she cried, her voice somehow cutting through the noise. "Please stop!" The front ranks of the crowd hesitated, shocked to see a gentlewoman standing between them and their target. Confused faces stared at her. The momentum faltered. "Miss Hale," Thornton said behind her, his voice urgent, "get out of the way. This is not your—" "Be quiet," she snapped without turning around. She kept her eyes on the crowd, on Nicholas Higgins in the front rank looking at her with an expression of confused anguish. "Please," she said, trying to keep her voice steady even though she was shaking. "I know you're angry, I know you've suffered. But this is not the way. If you hurt him, if you do this, you will be the ones who suffer. You will be arrested, imprisoned, maybe hanged. Your families will lose you. Please. Please think he brought in Irish workers," someone shouted from the crowd. "While our children starve, he replaces us." "I know," Margaret said. "I know it feels like a betrayal, but killing him will not bring those jobs back. It will only destroy you and everyone who depends on you." For a moment, she thought it might work. The crowd was listening, some faces showing doubt, uncertainty. The violence hung balanced on a knife's edge. But then someone from the back shouted, "She's one of them, she doesn't care about us." And a stone flew through the air. Margaret did not see it coming. She only felt the sudden, shocking impact against her forehead, felt pain explode across her skull, felt something warm running down her face. The world tilted, her knees buckled, and she felt herself falling. Strong arms caught her. Thornton had moved in an instant, was holding her, supporting her weight. She looked up at him and saw his face transformed by horror and rage. "You animals," he roared at the crowd, his voice shaking with fury. "You've struck a woman who was trying to save you from yourselves." The crowd recoiled. Shame and shock rippled through the ranks. They had not meant to hurt her, had not seen her in the trajectory of the stone, had been aiming for Thornton. But they had hit her instead, and the sight of blood on her pale face, of her limp in Thornton's arms, seemed to snap them back to themselves. Nicholas Higgins pushed forward, his face stricken. "Miss Hale, I'm sorry, we didn't—" "Get back," Thornton said, his voice deadly quiet now. "All of you get back, you've done enough." The fight had gone out of the crowd. People began to retreat, muttering, ashamed, frightened by what they had done. Within minutes, the courtyard was clearing. The riot was over. Thornton lifted Margaret in his arms with surprising gentleness and carried her into the mill, into his office, where he laid her carefully on a sofa. His hands were shaking as he took out a handkerchief and pressed it to the wound on her forehead. The cut was not deep, but it was bleeding profusely, as head wounds do, staining his handkerchief red. "Why did you do that?" he asked, his voice hoarse. "Why did you put yourself in danger for me?" Margaret's head was spinning. Pain throbbed through her skull, but she was conscious enough to hear the rawness in his voice, to see the stricken look in his eyes. He had been composed facing the mob, had been ready to die without flinching. But now, looking at her blood on his hands, he looked undone. "I couldn't let them hurt you," she whispered, "no matter our differences. I couldn't stand by and watch that." He stared at her as if seeing her for the first time. "You could have been killed, that stone, if it had struck you differently." "But it didn't," she said, trying for steadiness. "I'm all right, just." Shaken, but she was not all right. The room was spinning, and she felt a wave of nausea rising. Thornton saw it, saw her skin go even paler, and called urgently for water, for someone to fetch a doctor. The next hour passed in a blur for Margaret. A doctor came and cleaned and bandaged the wound, declaring that she had a mild concussion but would recover. Thornton sent word to her father, who arrived in a state of near panic. Through it all, Thornton hovered, his face gray with worry and something else, something that looked like anguish or guilt, or perhaps a dawning realization of what her intervention meant. When Mr. Hale tried to thank him for caring for Margaret, Thornton shook his head. "I am the one who owes her thanks, Mr. Hale. She saved my life. She put herself between me and a mob that would have killed me without hesitation. I do not understand why she did it, but I will never forget it." Later, when they had taken Margaret home and put her to bed, she lay in the darkness trying to understand herself. Why had she done it? Why had she risked her life for a man she claimed to despise? A man who represented everything she hated about Milton and its harsh industrial philosophy. But even as she asked the question, she knew, deep down, that her feelings about John Thornton had never been as simple as contempt. She had been drawn to him from the beginning, even as she fought against the attraction. Drawn to his strength, his intelligence, his unwavering principles even when she disagreed with them. Drawn to the complexity she sensed beneath his stern exterior, the depth of feeling he worked so hard to control. And he had held her so carefully, looked at her with such raw emotion when he thought she was badly hurt. There had been nothing cold about him in that moment, nothing hard or unfeeling, just fear and gratitude and something that looked terrifyingly like, no, she would not think it, she could not. But sleep was a long time coming that night, and when it came, it was filled with confused dreams of smoke and stones, and dark eyes looking at her as if she were the most precious thing in the world. In his own house across town, John Thornton sat in his study, staring at the handkerchief still stained with Margaret's blood. He had faced the mob without fear. He had been prepared to die defending his principles. But when he had seen her fall, when he had caught her and felt her weight in his arms, when he had seen blood on her beautiful face, he had felt something break open in his chest like a dam giving way. She had risked her life for him. Margaret Hale, who despised him, who argued with him, who looked at him with disdain, she had thrown herself between him and death. And that meant something. It had to mean something. He loved her. He had known it for weeks, but now it was no longer just a feeling he could suppress or ignore. It was an overwhelming certainty, a fact that had seared itself into his heart when he held her in his arms and felt the terrible vulnerability of her humanity, the precious fragility of her life. And he had no idea whether she felt anything for him at all, or whether her intervention had been simple human compassion, the act of someone who could not watch another person be murdered regardless of personal feeling. But he knew, sitting there in the dark, that he had to find out. He had to tell her. He could not continue this way, loving her in silence, pretending indifference, maintaining the fiction of mere pupil and tutor's daughter. He would tell her. Whatever the consequences, whatever the risk of rejection and humiliation, he would tell her the truth, and pray that the woman who had saved his life might somehow be willing to save him in a different way, by loving him back. Margaret spent several days recovering from the blow to her head. The wound itself was not serious, but the concussion left her dizzy and weak, forced to lie in a darkened room while her mother fussed anxiously and her father read to her in gentle tones. But the physical injury was nothing compared to the confusion in her heart. She could not stop thinking about the riot, about the moment she had thrown herself in front of Thornton, about the way he had looked at her afterward. She told herself it meant nothing, that she had simply acted on humanitarian instinct, that she would have done the same for anyone about to be killed by a mob. But the memory of his arms around her, of his voice shaking with emotion, of the devastating tenderness with which he had cared for her wound, those memories would not be dismissed so easily. And she found she could not hate him anymore, could not see him as simply the cold industrialist, the heartless master. He was more complicated than that. He was a man of fierce principles, yes, of rigid self-discipline, of uncompromising standards. But he was also capable of depth, of feeling, of vulnerability that he normally kept hidden behind iron control. When he came for his lesson with her father the following week, Margaret stayed in her room. She was not ready to face him, not yet. But she heard his voice in the hall, asking after H. Hale how she was recovering, and the concern in his tone was unmistakable. A few days later, when she was feeling stronger, Margaret ventured downstairs. She happened to be in the parlor when Thornton arrived for his appointment. Their eyes met, and for a moment neither spoke. Then he bowed and she nodded, and he asked very formally after her health. "I am quite recovered, thank you, Mr. Thornton," she said, her voice cool and polite. "I am glad," he said, and then with visible effort, "Miss Hale, I must. I need to speak with you, privately, when you are well enough." Margaret's heart began to beat faster. Yes, if you wish." He looked at her father. "Mr. Hale, might I have a few moments with your daughter?" "I promise to be entirely proper." Mr. Hale looked surprised but nodded. "Of course, I will be in my study if you need me." He left, and Margaret and Thornton were alone. The air in the room felt suddenly thick, charged with unspoken words. Thornton stood near the window, his back to the light, his face in shadow. When he spoke, his voice was low and strained. "Miss Hale, I have tried to remain silent. I have tried to keep my feelings to myself. But after what happened, after you risked your life for mine, I cannot continue the pretense any longer." Margaret felt a cold knot forming in her stomach. She knew suddenly what he was going to say, and she did not want to hear it. "I love you," Thornton said, the words torn from him like a confession. "I have loved you almost from the moment we met. I know you think little of me. I know you despise what I represent, that you find me harsh and unfeeling. But I cannot help what I feel. You have become everything to me. Your good opinion matters more than any success, any wealth, anything I have ever worked for. I am asking you, I am begging you, if there is any chance you could feel the same way, any hope that you might learn to care for me." He stopped, breathing hard, looking at her with such naked hope and vulnerability that Margaret felt something twist painfully in her chest. But she also felt panic rising. This was too much, too sudden. She had not had time to understand her own feelings, had not sorted through the confusion and conflict. And the idea of marrying John Thornton, of binding herself to this life in Milton, of becoming the wife of a manufacturer, it felt like a betrayal of everything she had valued, everything Hellstone represented. "Mr. Thornton," she said, trying to keep her voice steady, I am honored by your regard, but I do not love you, I cannot marry you." The words fell like blows. She saw him flinch, saw color drain from his face. "You do not love me," he repeated, as if trying to comprehend an impossible statement. "No," Margaret said, though even as she spoke, she felt the lie of it somewhere deep inside. "I respect you. I appreciate your character. But love, no, I do not feel that way about you." For a long moment, Thornton said nothing. He stood very still, as if turned to stone. Then he nodded once sharply. "I see. I was mistaken, then, in the significance of what you did during the riot. You did not act out of any particular feeling for me, but simply out of general human compassion." "I could not watch you be killed," Margaret said. "That does not mean I wish to marry you." The words were crueler than she intended. She saw him take them like physical blows, saw pain flash across his face before his expression closed down, locked tight. "I understand," he said, his voice now completely flat, devoid of emotion. "I apologize for having troubled you with my feelings. It was presumptuous of me to imagine that you could care for someone so beneath your social standing." "That is not," Margaret started, but he cut her off. "Please do not make excuses to spare my pride. You have made your feelings perfectly clear." He bowed, formal and cold as ice. "I will speak to your father about concluding our lessons. It would not be appropriate for me to continue visiting this house. Good day, Miss Hale." He left before she could respond, before she could explain, before she could say anything that might soften the brutal finality of her rejection. Margaret stood alone in the parlor, shaking. She told herself she had done the right thing. She did not love him. She did not want to marry him. She had been honest, and honesty was better than leading him on with false hope. But if it was the right thing, why did she feel as if she had just made a terrible mistake? Why did the memory of his face, when she said she did not love him, make her want to call him back, to unsay the words, to tell him what? That she did not know her own heart, that she was confused, uncertain, afraid. She sat down slowly, put her face in her hands, and tried not to cry. Over the following days, the full weight of what had happened settled over her. Thornton did not return to the house. Mr. Hale was bewildered and hurt. He had valued Thornton's company and could not understand why the lessons had so suddenly ceased. Margaret could not bring herself to tell him the truth. She muttered something about Thornton being too busy with mill affairs, and her father accepted it but looked troubled. Margaret tried to return to her normal routines, visiting Bessie Higgins, helping her mother, walking through Milton streets. But everything felt different now, flat, colorless. She found herself thinking constantly about Thornton, remembering his declaration, the hope in his eyes, the devastating pain when she rejected him. And she began to wonder if she had been lying. Not to him, but to herself. Because the more she thought about it, the more she realized that her feelings for John Thornton were far more complex than simple dislike or respect. She had always been aware of him, always argued with him with an intensity that suggested her emotions were engaged. She had risked her life for him not out of abstract principle, but because the thought of him dying was unbearable. And now that he was gone from her life, now that he would not be coming to the house, would not be engaging her in fierce debates, would not be looking at her with those dark, intense eyes, now she felt his absence like a wound. But it was too late. She had refused him. She had told him she did not love him. He would never come back, never give her another chance. She had burned that bridge completely. Bessie Higgins, growing weaker by the day, asked her one afternoon about Mr. Thornton. "I heard he made you an offer, Miss Hale, and you turned him down." Margaret was startled. "How did you servants talk?" Bessie said with a faint smile. "And Milton's a small world for all its size. Did you really refuse him?" "Yes," Margaret said quietly. "Did you not care for him?" Margaret hesitated. I don't know, I was confused. It was so sudden." Bessie looked at her with eyes that were far too knowing. "I think you did care for him, miss. I think you still do, but you're afraid of what it means." "Afraid," Margaret said, defensive. "Afraid of admitting you could love someone so different from what you expected. Someone from this world you've always thought beneath you." Bessie's voice was gentle, without judgment. "But love doesn't ask permission, miss. It doesn't wait for us to be ready. And sometimes the best things come in forms we never imagined." Margaret had no answer. She sat with Bessie in silence, holding her frail hand, wondering if the girl was right. Wondering if she had thrown away something precious because she was too proud, too stubborn, too afraid to let the North into her heart. And across town, in his large, empty house, John Thornton sat in his study and stared at nothing, feeling the weight of rejection settle over him like a shroud. He had known it was a risk. He had known she probably did not care for him. But some foolish part of him had hoped that her intervention during the riot meant something, that beneath her disdain there might be the seeds of affection. He had been wrong, she had been quite clear. She did not love him. She pitied him enough to save his life, but not enough to share it. He would survive this, he told himself. He had survived poverty, his father's death, years of grueling work and sacrifice. He would survive having his heart broken by a woman who would never see him as anything more than a rough, uneducated tradesman. But survival, he was learning, was not the same as living. And a life without Margaret Hale in it felt like no life at all. The months that followed Thornton's proposal were the darkest Margaret had known since leaving Hellstone. Death came to Milton like a slow tide, inevitable and remorseless. First, Bessie Higgins. Margaret had visited her faithfully throughout her illness, reading to her, talking quietly, holding her hand as she struggled to breathe through lungs that were more scar tissue than healthy flesh. Bessie had faced her approaching death with a kind of quiet faith that Margaret found both heartbreaking and humbling. She spoke of heaven as if it were a real place, somewhere she would finally be able to breathe freely, to rest after years of labor and suffering. "Don't grieve too much for me, Miss Hale," she had said one afternoon, her voice barely a whisper. "I'm going somewhere better, somewhere without cotton dust and 12-hour shifts and hunger. I'm going home." "You are home," Margaret had said, tears sliding down her face despite her effort to be brave. "No, miss," Bessie smiled faintly. "This was never home, just a stopping place. Hard and painful, but necessary maybe. But home is still ahead." She died on a gray morning in autumn, with her father holding one hand and Margaret holding the other. One moment she was breathing, labored and painful. The next she was still. The suffering left her face in that moment, leaving behind something that looked almost like peace. Nicholas Higgins wept like a child. This big, strong man who had faced down masters and stood firm during strikes collapsed completely in the face of losing his daughter. Margaret tried to comfort him, but what comfort was there? Bessie had been barely 20 years old. She should have had a lifetime ahead of her. Instead, she was dead, killed by the very industry that was supposed to provide for her. Margaret helped arrange the funeral, paid for what the Higgins family could not afford. She stood in the rain at the graveside and watched them lower Bessie's coffin into the ground, and she felt rage as well as grief. Rage at a system that consumed young lives so casually, that treated workers as expendable, that valued profit over human breath. She wondered if Thornton was grieving too, if he felt any responsibility for the deaths of workers who breathed poison in his mills. But she had not seen him in weeks, had no idea what he was thinking or feeling, and she had no right to ask. The grief over Bessie had barely begun to fade when Margaret's mother fell ill. Mrs. Hale had been declining for months, growing thinner and weaker, complaining of pain in her chest. The doctors diagnosed consumption, though they offered little hope of recovery. The disease was too far advanced, they said. She had perhaps months, perhaps only weeks. Margaret threw herself into nursing her mother with desperate intensity, as if perfect care could somehow hold death at bay. She sat up through long nights, sponging her mother's fevered skin, adjusting pillows, reading aloud, doing anything and everything to ease her suffering. Mrs. Hale drifted in and out of clarity. Sometimes she knew where she was, recognized Margaret and her husband. Other times she thought she was back in her youth, in London, before marriage and disappointment and the steady erosion of hope. She spoke of balls and suitors and a life she might have had if she had made different choices. "I loved your father," she told Margaret one night, lucid for a moment. "I did, but I also gave up so much to marry him, society, elegance, the life I was raised for, and I never quite forgave him for it, never quite let him forget. That was wrong of me. Tell him I'm sorry." "You can tell him yourself, Mama," Margaret said, though they both knew she could not. She was too weak to speak much longer. "Be kinder than I was," Mrs. Hale whispered. "Don't make my mistakes. Don't let pride cost you love." Margaret thought of Thornton, of his proposal, of her rejection. Was that what she had done? Let pride cost her love. But her mother was drifting again, back into fevered dreams, and Margaret could only sit beside her and wait for the end. Mrs. Hale died on a cold November night, with her husband and daughter at her bedside. She went quietly, a sigh that did not turn into another breath. One moment she was there. The next she was gone. Mr. Hale broke down completely. He had loved his wife despite their differences, despite her disappointments and regrets. And now she was gone, and with her went his last connection to Hellstone, to the life they had shared before his crisis of conscience changed everything. Margaret tried to be strong for him, tried to manage the funeral arrangements, tried to hold the household together. But inside she felt hollow, scraped clean by grief. 2 deaths in as many months, 2 people she loved gone, and she found herself thinking about Bessie's words. This was never home, just a stopping place. Hard and painful, but necessary maybe. But home is still ahead. Where was home? Not Hellstone, that was lost forever. Not Milton, she would never belong here. Nowhere, perhaps. Maybe home was not a place at all, but a person, or a feeling, or something she had not yet found. In the midst of their grief, word came from London that Margaret's godfather, Mr. Bell, wished to visit. He arrived like a breath of fresh air from the outside world, kind and sympathetic, offering both practical help and genuine understanding. He had been Mr. Hale's friend at Oxford, and he grieved the loss of Mrs. Hale sincerely. But he also brought news. He was elderly and in declining health, and he wanted to make sure his affairs were in order. He had no children of his own, and he intended to make Margaret his heir. She would inherit his property, including the income from the mills he owned in Milton, one of which, he mentioned casually, was leased to a Mr. John Thornton. Margaret received this news with mixed feelings. Security, yes. Financial independence, but also another tie to Milton, to the industrial world she had tried so hard to reject. And a connection, however indirect, to Thornton. She would be, in essence, his landlord. Mr. Bell also made another suggestion. He urged Mr. Hale to take a holiday, to leave Milton for a few weeks and visit Hellstone one last time. The change of scene would do him good, help him recover from the shock of his wife's death. Mr. Hale agreed, almost desperately. He needed to see Hellstone again, to remember better times, to find some comfort in the landscape of his former life. They went, leaving Margaret in the care of a trusted servant. And Margaret, alone in the house for the first time in months, felt the full weight of her isolation settle over her. She was 20 years old, unmarried, essentially motherless, and trapped in a town she had never wanted to call home. She walked through Milton streets like a ghost, visiting the Higgins household to check on Nicholas, who was trying to manage without his daughter. She helped where she could, but she felt useless, powerless against the great machine of industry and poverty that ground people up without mercy. And sometimes, walking past Marlborough Mills, she would look up at the windows and wonder if Thornton was there, if he ever thought about her, if he had moved on from his rejected proposal, or if he carried the wound of it as she seemed to be carrying the regret. She never saw him. It was as if he had deliberately arranged his life to avoid any chance encounter. And Margaret told herself she was glad. What would they say to each other anyway? The gulf between them was as wide as ever, maybe wider now, deepened by the awkwardness of his declaration and her refusal. But she was not glad. She was lonely and grieving, and beginning to wonder if she had made a terrible mistake that could never be undone. Then, just as she was starting to adjust to her father's absence, just as she was finding some fragile equilibrium in her new reality, word came from Hellstone. Her father had collapsed. He was gravely ill. She must come immediately. Margaret traveled south in a panic, her heart pounding with dread. Not him too, not her father. He was all she had left, the only family, the only connection to who she used to be. But when she arrived at the house where he was staying, she saw immediately that it was too late. He was dying, the doctor said. His heart was simply giving out, weakened by grief and strain. There was nothing to be done. Margaret sat with him through his final hours. He was barely conscious, drifting in and out of awareness. But once he opened his eyes and saw her, and smiled with such love and recognition that her heart broke all over again. "My brave Margaret," he whispered, "so proud of you, so sorry to leave you alone." "I'll be all right, Papa," she lied. "Don't worry about me." "You'll find your way," he said. "You're stronger than you know, braver, trust yourself. Trust your heart." Those were his last coherent words. He slipped away shortly after, his breathing growing slower and slower until it stopped entirely. And Margaret, who had tried to be strong through her mother's death and Bessie's death and all the losses and griefs of the past year, finally broke. She wept until she had no tears left, until she was empty, hollow, scraped clean. Both parents gone, Hellstone lost, Milton unbearable. She was alone in the world, orphaned at 20, with money she did not want and a future she could not imagine. When she returned to Milton for the funeral, the town looked even grimmer than before, the smoke thicker, the streets darker. This place had taken everything from her. Her peace, her happiness, both her parents, even the possibility of love with a man she had pushed away. And she had nothing left to lose, which somehow made her even more afraid. Because when you have nothing left to lose, you also have nothing left to hold on to, nothing to anchor you. You are simply adrift, waiting to see where the current takes you next. Margaret stood at her father's grave in Milton's cemetery. He had wanted to be buried near his wife, and felt the weight of solitude like a stone in her chest. She was utterly, completely alone, and she had no idea how to bear it. In the midst of Margaret's overwhelming grief, a letter arrived that would complicate her life even further. It was from her brother Frederick. Frederick Hale had been away for years, serving in the Royal Navy, but he had not left voluntarily. He had been part of a mutiny against a brutal captain, had fled England to avoid court-martial and certain execution. He lived now in Spain, in exile under an assumed name, unable ever to return home without risking arrest and death. Margaret had not seen him since she was a child, but when he wrote that he had heard of their mother's death, and that he wanted to come, just for a few days, to say goodbye at her grave and to see his father one last time, Margaret's heart broke for him. She wrote back immediately, warning him of the danger. Their father was dying too. She could not bring herself to say he was already dead. If Frederick came, he would be risking his life. The Navy was still looking for mutineers. If he was recognized, he would be arrested. But Frederick was determined. He wrote back saying he would come in secret, disguised, for just 2 days. He needed to see them, needed to make peace with the past, needed to pay his respects to the mother he had not been able to bury. Margaret was torn between longing to see her brother and terror for his safety. But she could not deny him. He was family, the only family she had left now that both parents were gone. So she agreed to help him, to arrange for him to come to Milton in secret, to hide him and protect him for those brief, dangerous days. Frederick arrived on a gray afternoon, heavily disguised with a beard and rough clothing, looking like a common laborer rather than a naval officer. Margaret barely recognized him. He had changed so much, older, weathered, marked by years of exile and the constant fear of discovery. But when he embraced her, she knew him immediately, her brother. The last connection to her childhood, to the family that had once been whole. They wept together for their mother, for their father, for all the years they had lost. Frederick visited the graves, stood in silent grief, said the words he needed to say to parents who could no longer hear him. And for those 2 days, Margaret felt a little less alone, a little less adrift. But the danger was constant and real. Every moment Frederick spent in Milton was a risk. If anyone recognized him, reported him, he would be arrested and hanged. Margaret lived in a state of constant tension, jumping at every knock on the door, every unexpected sound. And then, on Frederick's last night in Milton, as Margaret was walking him to the train station for his departure, the thing she most feared happened. They encountered Leonards, a man who had served in the Navy, who had known Frederick years ago. Margaret saw recognition flare in the man's eyes even before he spoke. "Hail," Leonard said, squinting at Frederick in the dim light of the station. "Frederick Hale, but you're wanted for—" "You're mistaken," Margaret interjected quickly, stepping between them. "This is my cousin, visiting from Spain. You must have him confused with someone else." Leonards was drunk, swaying on his feet, but he was insistent. "No, I know you. I served with you on the Orion. You're that mutineer they've been hunting." Frederick's face had gone pale. He glanced at Margaret, silently asking what to do. Run, fight, try to talk his way out. But Leonards was louder now, attracting attention. Mutineer. This man's a wanted criminal. In desperation, Frederick shoved the man away, trying to escape. Leonard stumbled backward, lost his balance at the edge of the platform, and fell. His head struck the platform edge with a sickening crack, and he lay still. For a moment, Margaret and Frederick stood frozen, staring at the motionless body. People were starting to gather, asking what happened, trying to help Leonards. The situation was spiraling out of control. "Go," Margaret said urgently to Frederick. "Get on the train, go now, I'll handle this." "But, G.O." Frederick hesitated one more second, then disappeared into the crowd and onto the train. Margaret heard the whistle blow, heard the train begin to move, carrying her brother away to safety, or at least away from immediate capture. She turned back to the crowd around Leonards. Someone was saying he was breathing, that he was alive but unconscious. Someone else was asking what happened, how he fell. And Margaret, terrified, desperate to protect her brother, told a lie. She said she had been alone at the station. She had seen a man fall, but she did not know how or why. There had been no one else involved. The people around her seemed to accept this explanation. Leonards, when he eventually came to, was too drunk and confused to tell a coherent story. He muttered about a mutineer, but no one took him seriously. Margaret was a respectable young woman, recently orphaned, grieving. Why would she lie? But someone had seen. Someone had been at the station, had witnessed the whole encounter in the shadows where Margaret had not noticed him. John Thornton. He had been there on business, arranging shipments, and he had seen Margaret with a man he did not recognize. Had seen them arguing with Leonards. Had seen the push, the fall. And though he had not heard the words clearly enough to understand about Frederick or the mutiny charge, he had seen enough to know that Margaret was lying to protect the man she had been with. His heart had sunk when he saw her with another man, so there was someone, he thought, someone she cared about enough to meet at night, to walk with through the streets. The man she had, perhaps, been thinking of when she refused Thornton's proposal. And when she lied to protect him, when Thornton saw her fabricate a story to shield this man from consequences, it confirmed everything he feared. There was someone else, someone she loved enough to risk her reputation for. Thornton did not come forward to contradict her story. He could not bear to expose her, to see her arrested for perjury or obstruction. But he walked away from the station feeling as if something inside him had died. All these months he had hoped foolishly that perhaps in time she might reconsider, might soften toward him. But now he knew the truth. She loved another man, and that made any hope of winning her affection impossible. Margaret, oblivious to Thornton's presence that night, returned home shaking with relief and shame. Frederick had escaped. He was safe. But she had lied, and the lie sat in her stomach like poison. When the police came to question her the next day, Leonards had reported an assault. Though he was too confused to identify his attacker, Margaret repeated her lie. She had seen nothing, knew nothing, was merely a witness to an accident. The police inspector looked at her searchingly. He seemed to doubt her story, but he had no evidence to contradict it. And Margaret was a gentlewoman, recently bereaved, with no apparent reason to lie. He let it go, though she could see he was not entirely convinced. After he left, Margaret sat alone in the empty house and felt shame wash over her like a wave. She had always prided herself on her honesty, her integrity, her moral clarity. And now she had lied to the police, had obstructed justice, had compromised everything she believed in to protect her brother. Was it justified? Frederick would have been hanged if she had told the truth. What else could she have done? But the justification did not make the shame go away. She had lied. She felt dirty, tainted, as if something essential in her character had been permanently stained. And there was no one she could tell, no one she could confess to. Frederick was gone, back to Spain, safe but forever exiled. Her parents were dead. She had no friends in Milton close enough to share this burden with. She was alone with her secret, alone with her shame, alone in a town that felt more like a prison with every passing day. Word of the incident spread through Milton, of course. In a town where everyone knew everyone's business, Margaret's involvement, however peripheral, in an incident at the train station was noted and discussed. And there were whispers, vague and uncertain, that perhaps she had not told the whole truth, that perhaps there was more to the story than she admitted. Her reputation, always somewhat precarious as an outsider in Milton, suffered. People began to look at her differently, with curiosity or suspicion or pity. She felt their eyes on her when she walked through the streets, felt their whispered speculations. And somewhere in Milton, John Thornton heard the whispers too. Heard that Margaret Hale had been involved in something questionable, that she may have lied to protect a man, that there were rumors of impropriety. And each rumor drove the knife deeper into his heart, because he knew they were true. He had seen it himself. She had lied, and she had done it for another man. He had loved her despite her disdain for him. He had hoped against hope that time might change her feelings. But now he knew that hope was futile. She belonged to someone else. And Thornton, proud and hurt and unable to bear seeing her knowing what he knew, withdrew even further from any sphere where they might cross paths. Margaret, walking through Milton in a haze of grief and shame, was unaware of Thornton's thoughts, his pain, his misunderstanding. She was unaware that his coldness, when she occasionally saw him from a distance, stemmed not from indifference, but from the agony of believing she loved another man. They were both suffering, both isolated, both trapped in misunderstandings and pride, and the terrible loneliness of loving someone who seemed forever out of reach. But neither knew the other's heart. Neither could see past their own pain to recognize the mirror image of it in the other. And so they remained divided, separated by secrets and lies, and the bitter knowledge that sometimes the people we love most are the ones we can never, ever have. The months after the incident at the train station were among the most painful Margaret had ever endured, and that was saying something given all she had already suffered. She stayed in Milton because she had nowhere else to go. Mr. Bell, her godfather, insisted she remain in the house her father had rented, at least until his estate was settled, and she decided what to do with her inheritance. But every day in that town felt like slow suffocation. The shame of her lie never left her. It sat in her chest like a stone, heavy and cold. She had compromised her own integrity to protect Frederick, and while she could not regret saving her brother's life, she also could not escape the knowledge that she had become someone she did not recognize, someone who lied to the police, who obstructed justice, who hid the truth. And the whispers continued. People in Milton talked, they speculated. Who was the man Margaret had been with that night? Why was she so defensive about it? What was she hiding? Her reputation suffered. She was no longer simply the parson's daughter, the genteel outsider. Now she was the woman with secrets, the woman who might not be quite respectable. She felt it in the way people looked at her, the slight coolness in greetings, the way conversations stopped when she approached. She bore it with outward composure, but inside she was crumbling. Every loss, every grief, every shattered hope was taking its toll. She felt herself becoming hollow, a shell going through the motions of life without any real engagement or joy. And through it all, she thought about John Thornton. She saw him occasionally from a distance, a figure across the street, a man entering his mill, a shadow passing by her window late at night when he walked home from work. But they never spoke. They did not even make eye contact. It was as if he had erased her from his world completely. She told herself it was for the best. What would they have to say to each other anyway? She had refused his proposal. He had moved on. That was the end of it. But it did not feel like the end. It felt like an open wound that would not heal, a question that would never be answered, a possibility that had been destroyed before she even understood what it might have been. Slowly, painfully, Margaret was beginning to realize that she had made a terrible mistake. Not just in refusing Thornton, but in how she had judged him, how she had seen him only as a symbol and not as a man. She had been so certain of her own moral superiority, so convinced that the North was harsh and the South was gentle, That industry was cruel and rural life was kind. But Milton had taught her that the world was far more complicated than that. The workers she had befriended, Nicholas Higgins, Bessie, their neighbors, they were not simple victims. They had dignity, intelligence, pride. They fought for their rights even when it cost them everything. And the masters, whatever their faults, were not simple villains either. They were men caught in a system as harsh as the one that trapped their workers, subject to market forces and competition and economic realities that left little room for sentiment. And Thornton, she was beginning to understand that he was more than just the stern mill owner she had first seen. He was a man who had risen from poverty through discipline and hard work. He cared about principle, about honesty, about doing what he believed was right even when it cost him. He was not cold, he was controlled because he had learned early that weakness meant destruction. He was not cruel. He was just in a harsh world that required hard decisions. She had judged him without really knowing him. She had refused to see past the surface to the complexity beneath, and now it was too late. Because Thornton, she had heard, was struggling. The cotton market had collapsed even further. Mills were closing across Milton. Workers were unemployed by the thousands. And Marlborough Mills, once so successful, was rumored to be in serious financial trouble. Margaret heard the whispers. Thornton was facing ruin. He might have to close the mill entirely, might lose everything he had worked for. And despite having rejected him, despite knowing she had no claim on him, Margaret found herself desperately worried. She wanted to help. She had money now from Mr. Bell's estate. She had more than enough to live on, more than she needed. If she could somehow assist Thornton, save his mill, prevent him from losing everything. But how? He would never accept charity from her. His pride was too great, and after the way she had rejected him, he would probably rather go bankrupt than take help from the woman who had humiliated him. Still, she had to try. She had to do something. She could not just stand by and watch him be destroyed, any more than she could have stood by and watched the mob kill him that day during the riot. She went to Nicholas Higgins for advice. The old worker, grieving for his daughter but still fighting for his principles, had developed a grudging respect for Thornton over the months. "He's hard, Miss Hale, but he's fair," Higgins said. "Harder on himself than on any of us, truth be told. And this is killing him, this failure, not because of the money particularly, but because he believes a man should succeed or fail on his own merit, and he's convinced he's failed." "Has he failed?" Margaret asked. "Or has the market simply turned against him through no fault of his own?" "The latter, I reckon," Higgins said. "But try telling him that. He blames himself for every worker he's had to let go, every family suffering because he can't provide employment. It's eating him alive." Margaret's heart ached. She wished she could go to him, could tell him it was not his fault, could somehow ease the burden he was carrying. But she had forfeited that right when she refused his love. She had no place in his life, no standing to offer comfort. And Thornton, for his part, was indeed being eaten alive by the slow collapse of everything he had built. He worked longer hours than ever, trying to find some way to save the mill, to keep it running, to provide for the workers who depended on him. But the economic forces were too strong. He could not compete with mills that had access to cheaper cotton, cheaper labor, better markets. He faced the prospect of bankruptcy with the same stern discipline he brought to everything else. He would pay his debts, liquidate his assets, take responsibility for his failure. He would not make excuses or blame external circumstances. A man stood or fell on his own merit, and if he fell, he accepted the consequences. But beneath the iron control, he was suffering. Not for himself. He had been poor before and could be poor again. But for his workers, for his mother and sister who depended on him, for the sense that everything he had worked for, everything he had sacrificed, was crumbling to dust. And he thought, sometimes, about Margaret, about how she had looked at him with disdain from the beginning, how she had judged his world harshly, how she had refused his love because he was not good enough for her. And he thought bitterly that she had been right. He was not good enough. He was a failed manufacturer, a man losing his mill, someone whose entire worth had been wrapped up in success and who now had nothing to offer. She loved another man anyway. That man she had protected at the train station, whoever he was. So it did not matter whether Thornton was successful or ruined. Either way, he could never have her. The knowledge sat in his chest like ice, cold and permanent and unbearably painful. Winter came to Milton, and with it a bleakness that seemed to settle over the entire town. Mills stood silent, chimneys cold. Workers huddled in their homes, burning the last of their fuel, wondering how they would survive the season. And Margaret, alone in her father's house, felt the darkness pressing in from all sides. She had lost everything that mattered: her parents, her home, her sense of who she was. And she had pushed away the one person who had offered her love, genuine and deep and unconditional. Thornton had seen past her disdain and her judgments and loved her anyway. And she had thrown it back in his face without even really considering what she was rejecting. Now he was suffering, and she could not help him. Now she understood what she had lost, and it was too late to recover it. She stood at her window one evening, looking out at the dark, smoky town, and felt tears sliding down her face. She wept for her parents, for Bessie, for Frederick in exile, for Nicholas Higgins grieving his daughter. She wept for the workers suffering through another cruel winter. She wept for Thornton facing ruin with no one to support him. And she wept for herself, for her loneliness and her regrets, and the slow, terrible realization that pride had cost her everything worth having. Her mother's dying words came back to her: "Don't let pride cost you love." But it already had. And Margaret did not know if there was any way to undo the damage, any way to bridge the chasm she herself had created. All she knew was that she was broken, humbled, stripped of all her certainties and judgments and self-righteous convictions. And in that broken state, finally empty of pride, she could see clearly for the first time. She loved John Thornton. She loved his strength and his principles and his fierce determination. She loved the way he had looked at her when he declared his feelings, with such hope and vulnerability beneath his stern exterior. She loved the man he was beneath the mill owner, beneath the harsh northern industrialist she had been so quick to judge. And she had destroyed any chance they might have had through her own blindness and arrogance. The winter night was dark and cold, and Margaret stood in it, alone, knowing that some mistakes cannot be unmade, some words cannot be unsaid, and some loves once refused can never be reclaimed. The truth, when it came, arrived in pieces, like light breaking through clouds after a long storm. The first piece came through Mr. Bell, Margaret's godfather, now her benefactor and the owner of the property Thornton leased for his mill, visited Milton on business. He was elderly and his health was declining, but he made the trip because he wanted to see how Margaret was managing, and because he needed to discuss the mill leases with his tenants. Over tea, he mentioned casually that he had met with Mr. Thornton to discuss the lease renewal. "Fine man, that Thornton," Mr. Bell said. "Upright, honest to a fault. He's in financial difficulties at the moment. The whole cotton trade is suffering, but he refuses to make excuses or ask for special terms. Insisted on the full lease payment even though it might bankrupt him. Said a contract is a contract, and a man honors his obligations regardless of circumstances." Margaret's heart clenched. Is he going to lose the mill? Possibly, Mr. Bell said. Unless he can find capital somewhere or the market turns. But he's too proud to ask for help and too principled to compromise his standards. He'll go down with honor if he goes down at all. Margaret thought about this for days afterward. Thornton was facing ruin, and his pride, the same fierce pride that had driven him to succeed, that had made him who he was now preventing him from seeking the help that might save him. She wondered if there was something she could do. She had money now, considerable money from Mr. Bell's estate. She could help. She could invest in the mill, provide capital, save Thornton from bankruptcy. But how could she offer without insulting him? How could she make him accept help from the woman who had refused his love? While she wrestled with this question, the second piece of truth arrived in the form of a letter from Frederick. Her brother wrote from Spain, thanking her again for hiding him, for lying to protect him, for risking her own reputation and safety to keep him from arrest. He also mentioned that he had heard, through roundabout channels, of Leonard's death. The man had died weeks after the incident at the train station, from complications related to his alcoholism rather than the blow to his head. There would be no further investigation, no danger to Frederick, no consequences to Margaret's life. The relief was overwhelming. Margaret wept with it, tears of release after months of carrying the weight of shame and fear. The lie that had haunted her was no longer a sword hanging over her head. Frederick was safe. She was safe. But then came the third piece of truth, and this one was harder to bear. She happened to encounter Mr. Thornton on the street. It was unavoidable. They turned a corner at the same moment and nearly collided. Margaret stepped back, heart racing, unsure what to say. "Miss Hale," Thornton said, his voice rigidly formal. "Mr. Thornton," she replied. They stood there awkwardly for a moment. Margaret noticed how tired he looked, how worn. The strain of fighting to save his mill had carved lines into his face that had not been there before. "I heard about your financial difficulties," Margaret said before she could stop herself. I am sorry." His expression hardened. "I do not need your pity, Miss Hale." "It is not pity," she said quickly. "It is concern for someone I respect." He looked at her with something that might have been bitter amusement. "Respect, yes. You have always respected me, have you not? From a safe distance with all proper correctness, but never anything more." "That is not fair," Margaret said, stung. "Is it not?" His voice was quiet but intense. "You made your feelings very clear when I declared myself. You do not love me. You told me so quite directly, so forgive me if I find your sudden concerns somewhat ironic." Margaret felt her face flush. I was confused. I did not understand myself or you, or you were simply being honest," Thornton said, "which I can hardly fault since I value honesty above all else, even when it wounds." He bowed slightly and moved to walk past her, but Margaret, desperate not to let this opportunity slip away, reached out and caught his arm. "Please," she said. "Please wait." He stopped, looking down at her hand on his sleeve, then up at her face. "I need to tell you something," Margaret said, her voice shaking, "about that night at the train station. About the man you saw me with." Thornton's expression went cold. "You owe me no explanations about your personal affairs, Miss Hale. The man was my brother," Margaret said in a rush. "Frederick. He was wanted by the Navy for mutiny, and he came in secret to see our mother's grave. I lied to protect him. That is why I told the police I was alone. That is why I seemed to be hiding something, because I was. But it was not what you thought." Thornton stared at her, his face showing a succession of emotions: disbelief, comprehension, shock, and then something that might have been hope. "Your brother," he said slowly. "Yes. I did not lie to protect a lover. I lied to save my brother's life, and I have been carrying the shame of that lie for months, even though I would do it again to keep Frederick safe." "Why are you telling me this?" Thornton asked, his voice rough. "Because," Margaret said, and her voice broke slightly, "because I cannot bear for you to think I am dishonest, or that I was protecting someone other than family. I cannot bear for you to think poorly of me." "I could never think poorly of you," Thornton said, and the words seemed dragged from somewhere deep inside him. "Even when I believed you loved another man, even when I thought you had lied, I could not stop loving you. I have tried, God knows I have tried, but I cannot. You are in my heart, Margaret, and I do not know how to get you out." The use of her first name, spoken with such raw emotion, made Margaret's heart leap. "John," she whispered. He closed his eyes as if hearing his name from her lips caused him pain. "I was wrong," Margaret said. "When you asked me to marry you, I was wrong to refuse. Not because I did not love you. I think I did, even then, though I did not recognize it, but because I was too proud, too certain of my own judgments, too blind to see what was right in front of me." "Margaret," he started, but she continued. "You are the best man I have ever known. The strongest, the most principled, the most capable of depth and feeling beneath that stern exterior you show the world. And I was a fool not to see it, not to value it, not to recognize what you were offering me." "You have been through terrible losses," Thornton said gently. "Grief can confuse." "I am not confused," Margaret interrupted. "I have never been more certain of anything in my life. I love you, John Thornton. I love your strength and your integrity and your fierce determination. I love the way you care about your workers even when you cannot show it. I love the way you held me when I was hurt, and the way you stood firm against that mob, and the way you have faced ruin without making excuses. I love you. And I do not expect you to believe me or to forgive me for how I treated you, but I needed you to know." For a long moment, Thornton said nothing. He was looking at her as if he had never seen her before, as if she were speaking a language he had forgotten. Then slowly, carefully, as if afraid she might vanish if he moved too quickly, he reached out and took her hand. "Say it again," he said hoarsely. "I love you. Again. I love you, John. I am sorry it took me so long to understand, but I do now. I love you." He pulled her into his arms, right there in the middle of the street, and held her as if she were the most precious thing in the world. Margaret felt his heart pounding against hers, felt his breath shuddering with the force of emotion he could no longer contain. "I never stopped loving you," he said into her hair. "Even when I thought it was hopeless, even when I believed you belonged to another man, I never stopped." They stood like that for a long moment, two people who had been so divided, so separated by pride and misunderstanding and stubborn principle, finally together, finally honest, finally able to admit what they felt. When they finally stepped apart, both had tears in their eyes. "There is still the matter of the mill," Thornton said, his practical nature reasserting itself even in the midst of emotion. "I am facing bankruptcy, Margaret. I have nothing to offer you, no wealth, no security, possibly no future at all." "Then we will face it together," Margaret said, "and as it happens, I have a proposal for you. A business proposal." She told him about her inheritance from Mr. Bell, about the money she had and did not need, about her desire to invest it in something worthwhile. "Let me invest in the mill, John. Not as charity, but as a genuine business partnership. You provide the expertise and the management. I provide the capital. We save the mill together, and we save the jobs of all those workers who depend on it." Thornton looked torn. "I cannot take your money, Margaret. It would not be charity," she said firmly. "It would be a sound investment. You are an excellent manager, John. The only reason you are struggling is the market collapse, which was beyond anyone's control. When the market recovers, and it will, the mill will be profitable again. My money will be well used. And in the meantime, we save livelihoods and futures." He studied her face, searching for certainty. "You are sure? I have never been more sure of anything." Slowly, Thornton smiled. It was the first genuine smile Margaret had ever seen from him, and it transformed his face entirely, making him look younger, less burdened, almost joyful. "Then yes," he said. "Yes to the investment. Yes to the partnership. Yes to everything." "Yes?" Margaret asked, hope flooding through her. "Yes," Thornton said, and he kissed her there in the street, where anyone could see, where the whole town could witness and gossip. And Margaret kissed him back, and did not care who saw, did not care what anyone thought, because she had found what she did not even know she was looking for. Not in the gentle South she had loved, and not in the harsh North she had resisted, but somewhere in between, in the meeting place of two worlds, two philosophies, two people who had learned, finally, to see each other truly. The partnership between Margaret and John Thornton, both personal and professional, transformed not just their lives, but the mill and the workers who depended on it. With Margaret's investment, Thornton was able to pay off his most pressing debts and keep Marlborough Mills running through the worst of the economic downturn. But more than that, the partnership changed how he thought about the relationship between master and worker, between capital and labor, between the old ways and the possibilities of the future. Margaret brought a different perspective, one shaped by her friendship with Nicholas Higgins and her time living among Milton's working families. She suggested innovations that Thornton, trapped in the traditional adversarial model, had never considered. What if, instead of seeing workers purely as employees to be managed, they were treated as partners with a stake in the mill's success? What if some of the profits were shared, creating loyalty and motivation rather than resentment? Thornton was skeptical at first. Such ideas went against everything he had learned, everything that had made him successful. But Margaret argued persistently, and her arguments were sound. Workers who felt valued worked harder, stayed longer, took pride in their product. It was not sentiment, it was good business. Gradually, hesitantly, Thornton began to implement changes. He improved ventilation in the carding rooms to reduce the cotton dust that killed workers like Bessie. He created a profit-sharing scheme for long-time employees. He established a school for workers' children, taught in the evenings, so they could learn to read and write without losing the wages they needed to survive. He began meeting with Nicholas Higgins and other union representatives not as adversaries, but as men with legitimate concerns worth hearing. The changes did not happen overnight. There was resistance from other manufacturers who thought Thornton was going soft, betraying his class. There was skepticism from workers who had been disappointed too often to trust easily. But slowly, gradually, a different model began to emerge at Marlborough Mills, one based on mutual respect rather than pure economic compulsion. And as the mill evolved, so did Milton itself. The worst of the economic crisis passed. Markets recovered. The chimneys began smoking again, but this time with a slightly different tenor. The town was still industrial, still harsh, still driven by the relentless machinery of progress. But there were glimpses of something better, something more human. Nicholas Higgins, now working at Marlborough Mills as a foreman and unofficial liaison between workers and management, spoke to Margaret one day about the changes. "I never thought I'd say this, Miss Hale, but your Mr. Thornton is proving me wrong about masters. Not completely. There's still too much distance between us and them, still too much power in their hands and not enough in ours. But he's trying, he's listening. That's more than most will do. He respects you," Margaret said. "He has never admitted it directly, but I know he values your perspective." "And I respect him," Higgins said, with the air of someone making a difficult confession. "Lord knows he's still hard as nails, still drives a bargain like no one else, but he's fair, and he cares, even if he hides it under all that northern sternness." Margaret smiled. She had learned to see past Thornton's stern exterior to the deep feeling beneath. She knew how much he cared about the mill, about the workers, about doing things right. He would never be soft or sentimental, it was not in his nature, but his sense of responsibility was absolute, and his commitment to justice was unwavering. Watching Milton change, watching the slow shift from pure antagonism to something more cooperative, Margaret thought about how far she had come from the girl who had arrived from Hellstone with such rigid judgments and certainties. She had thought the South was gentle and the North was harsh, that industry was evil and pastoral life was good, that she knew exactly how the world worked and what was right. But Milton had taught her that truth was more complex than that. The South had its own cruelties, poverty, rigid class systems, the quiet suffering of people trapped in traditions that never changed. The North was harsh, yes, but it was also vital, dynamic, offering opportunities that the rigid social structures of the South denied. Industry brought suffering, but it also brought employment and independence and the possibility of rising above the station of one's birth. And people were more complicated than the roles they played. Thornton was not just a harsh master, but a man of principles struggling to balance economic reality with human decency. The workers were not just victims, but strong, proud people fighting for their rights and their dignity. Even Milton itself, which she had hated so much when she arrived, had its own austere beauty, the beauty of human endeavor, of people working and building and striving to create something from nothing. One evening, Margaret and John walked together through the mill district at sunset. The sky above Milton was touched with color, gold, and rose filtering through the ever-present smoke, transforming it into something almost beautiful. The streets were quieter than usual, the day's work done, families gathering in their homes. "Do you still hate it here?" John asked, watching her face as she looked at the town. Margaret considered the question seriously. "I do not think I ever truly hated it. I hated what it represented, or what I thought it represented. I hated having to leave Hellstone, having to change, having to question all the certainties I had been raised with. But Milton itself, no, it is harsh and difficult and demanding, but it is also honest. There is no pretense here, no one pretending life is gentle when it is not. People work hard and suffer and fight and survive, and there is a kind of dignity in that." "You have changed," John said softly. "Yes," Margaret agreed. "We both have. You have learned to listen to workers instead of only commanding them. I have learned that strength can look like hardness, and that someone can be stern and loving at the same time." They walked in comfortable silence for a while, through streets that were becoming familiar to Margaret, that were slowly starting to feel like something she might call home. "Do you ever miss the South?" John asked. "Sometimes," Margaret admitted. "I miss the beauty, the green hills, the quiet. I miss my parents. I miss who I was before everything changed. But I would not go back even if I could." Because that Margaret, the one who lived in Hellstone and thought she knew everything, she was not capable of loving you. She was too proud, too certain, too blind. I had to lose everything, had to be broken down and rebuilt, to become someone who could see you truly. "Was it worth it?" John asked. "All that suffering just to be able to love a rough northern mill owner?" Margaret stopped walking and turned to face him. Around them, Milton's industrial landscape was softening in the evening light, the harshness blurred by shadows and the gentle colors of sunset. "Yes," she said simply. Every moment of suffering, every loss, every hard lesson, yes, it was worth it, because it brought me here, to you, to this. She gestured at the town around them, at the mill chimneys and the workers' houses and the cobbled streets. This is not the life I imagined for myself. It is harder and stranger and more complicated than anything I dreamed of in Hellstone. But it is real, it is honest. And it is mine. John pulled her close, and they stood together as the sun set over Milton, two people from different worlds who had learned to meet in the middle, to build something new from the collision of north and south, industry and tradition, harsh truth and gentle care. The mill would continue to operate, would face new challenges and weather new storms. The workers would continue to struggle, to organize, to fight for better conditions. The town would continue to change, evolving as England itself evolved into an industrial nation. Nothing was perfect, nothing was resolved completely. But here, in this moment, with the industrial sunset painting the sky above them, Margaret and John had found something worth holding on to. Not perfection, but partnership. Not ease, but honest struggle shared. Not the gentle pastoral dream of the South or the ruthless efficiency of the North, but something in between, something human, flawed, and real. And Milton, for all its harshness, for all its smoke and noise and unforgiving nature, had become the unlikely setting for a kind of love that neither of them could have predicted. Love built not on easy affection, but on respect earned through conflict, understanding forged through hardship, and commitment tested and proven through loss. The industrial age was harsh, yes, but it was also the age they lived in, the world they had to navigate. And together, Margaret and John were learning to find beauty even here, in the smoke-darkened streets and the thundering machinery and the faces of workers streaming home after a long day's labor. This was their world now. This was their home. And they would make it better, one small change at a time, one act of justice and compassion at a time, one day at a time. The sun slipped below the horizon, and the street lamps began to flicker on one by one, casting pools of yellow light on the cobblestones. And Margaret and John walked home together through the gathering darkness, hand in hand, ready to face whatever tomorrow would bring. The formal business arrangement took shape over the following weeks, with lawyers drawing up contracts and accountants reviewing numbers. But the real partnership, the one that mattered, was built in conversation, in shared decisions, in the slow process of learning to trust each other completely. Margaret proved to be a shrewd investor, asking hard questions about the mill's operations, about markets and supplies and competitive positioning. She was not content to simply provide money and step back. She wanted to understand, to be genuinely involved, to make sure her investment was sound. Thornton, initially uncomfortable with her scrutiny, gradually came to value it. She saw things he missed, asked questions he had not considered, brought a fresh perspective to problems he had been wrestling with alone for years. And she was fearless in her opinions, never intimidated by his expertise or his stern manner when he thought she was wrong. "You are the most difficult business partner I could have imagined," he told her one afternoon after a particularly spirited debate about wage structures. "Difficult," Margaret raised an eyebrow. "I prefer thorough. Difficult," he repeated, but he was smiling. "Stubborn, questioning, refusing to simply trust my judgment on matters I have far more experience with. Would you prefer a business partner who simply nodded and agreed with everything you said?" Margaret asked. "God, no," Thornton said fervently. "I would be bored senseless within a week." "Then you are stuck with difficult," Margaret said. "Apparently so," he agreed, "though I suspect I am also stuck with you in more permanent ways than just business." "I should hope so," Margaret said. "After all the trouble I went through to make you propose twice. I do not recall proposing a second time. Not formally, no. But that kiss in the middle of the street was rather definitive, do you not think?" Thornton laughed, a sound Margaret was learning to treasure because it came so rarely and so genuinely when it did. "Very well, Miss Hale, would you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" "I would be delighted, Mr. Thornton," Margaret said primly. They were married quietly a few months later, in a simple ceremony with only Nicholas Higgins and a few close friends as witnesses. Margaret wore a dress of cream silk, elegant but not ostentatious. John wore his best suit and looked, as Higgins commented afterward, terrified and exultant in equal measure. When the parson asked whether Margaret took John to be her husband, she said, "I do," with such conviction that several people in attendance dabbed at their eyes. And when John was asked the same question, his voice was completely steady as he said, "I do," but his eyes held such depth of feeling that Margaret felt her own tears rising. They were binding themselves together, two stubborn, proud, passionate people who had fought their way to understanding through grief and conflict and painful lessons. It was not a fairy tale romance. It was something harder, more real, more tested. And that made it stronger than any easy affection could have been. After the ceremony, they returned to the house that would now be theirs, the home John had built for his mother and sister, now expanded to include Margaret. Mrs. Thornton, John's mother, had been skeptical of Margaret at first, protective of her son and suspicious of this southern gentlewoman who had once refused him. But gradually, seeing how Margaret worked alongside John at the mill, how she challenged him and supported him in equal measure, Mrs. Thornton had softened. She would never be effusive, but she accepted Margaret, and that was enough. That first evening as man and wife, Margaret and John stood at the window looking out over Milton. The town was quiet, the mills shut down for the night, smoke still drifting lazily from the chimneys. It was not a beautiful view by conventional standards, but it was theirs. "Do you regret it?" John asked quietly. "Binding yourself to this life, to me," Margaret turned to look at him. "John Thornton, if you ask me that question one more time, I am going to become very cross with you." "It is a legitimate concern," he said. "You could have married someone from your own social class, someone with gentility and education, someone who could have given you the kind of life you were raised for." "I do not want that life," Margaret said firmly. "I want this one. With you, and I need you to believe that I have chosen freely, with full understanding, and without regret. Can you do that?" He looked at her for a long moment. "I am trying," he admitted. "But you must understand, I have worked my entire life to build something, to rise above poverty and make myself into someone worthy of respect. And yet when I look at you, I still sometimes see the girl from Hellstone who thought me beneath her, who saw me as nothing more than a rough tradesman." "That girl was a fool," Margaret said, "and she no longer exists. I have changed, John. We have both changed. The woman I am now sees you clearly. And what she sees is a man of extraordinary strength, integrity, and capacity for love. A man she is honored to call her husband." "You humble me," John said quietly. "Good," Margaret said. "You were far too proud before. As was I, we have both been humbled, and we are better for it." She took his hands in hers. "Listen to me, I love you. Not the way a silly girl loves a romantic ideal, but the way a woman loves a man she has come to know deeply, who has proven his worth through actions rather than words, who has shown her what true partnership means. I love you for your flaws as well as your virtues, because neither is simple and both are real. Do you understand?" "I am beginning to," John said. And then, with a hint of the dry humor Margaret was learning to recognize, though I suspect it will take repeated reminding before I fully believe it. "Then I will remind you daily," Margaret promised. And she did. In the months that followed, as they settled into married life and continued their work at the mill, Margaret made sure John understood that she had chosen him freely and chose him still, every day. She supported his decisions when she agreed with them and argued fiercely when she did not. She worked alongside him, learning the business, building relationships with workers and managers, becoming an integral part of the mill's operations. And slowly, John's lingering doubts faded. He began to trust, truly, that Margaret loved him as deeply as he loved her, that she was not going to wake up one day and realize she had made a terrible mistake, that this partnership, forged through conflict and misunderstanding and painful growth, was solid and real and permanent. Nicholas Higgins, watching them work together at the mill, shook his head in amazement. "Never thought I'd see it," he told Margaret one day. "A master and his wife who actually talk to workers like we're human, who ask our opinions and sometimes even take our advice. It's unnatural is what it is." "Is it?" Margaret asked with a smile. "Aye," Higgins said, "but I'm not complaining. Mr. Thornton was always fair even when he was hard, but with you here he's different. Still stern, still drives a tough bargain, but there's more give in him now, more willingness to see things from our side." "I think he was always willing," Margaret said. "He just needed permission to show it. To admit that strength and compassion are not opposites." "Maybe so," Higgins agreed. "All I know is conditions here are better than at any other mill in Milton, and word is spreading." We're getting the best workers, the most skilled hands, because people want to work where they're treated with respect. Which makes the mill more profitable, Margaret pointed out. Which proves that doing right and doing well are not incompatible. You and your logic, Higgins said, but he was smiling. Margaret thought about that conversation often in the weeks that followed. She and John were not changing the world, not overturning the entire industrial system. The basic structures of capital and labor remained. The fundamental inequalities remained. But within their small sphere of influence, they were proving that another way was possible. That masters and workers could cooperate rather than constantly war. That profit and principle could coexist. That treating people with dignity was not just morally right, but practically effective. It was not perfect. There were still conflicts, still moments of frustration and disagreement. John sometimes reverted to his old authoritarian style, and Margaret had to remind him to listen. The workers sometimes demanded more than was economically feasible, and Margaret had to help them understand the constraints. It was messy and complicated and required constant negotiation, but it was working. The mill was thriving. The workers were more loyal and productive, and Margaret and John were building something together that neither could have built alone, a life of shared purpose, honest partnership, and deep, abiding love. Standing at the mill gates one evening, watching workers stream out at the end of their shift, Margaret felt a profound sense of peace. This was not the life she had imagined in Hellstone. It was not romantic or picturesque or easy. But it was meaningful, it was real, it was hers, and she would not trade it for anything. And so our story comes to rest, like a train pulling into a station after a long journey through difficult terrain. Margaret Hale left the gentle green hills of the south and found herself in the smoke and stone of the industrial north. She left behind everything familiar, her home, her certainties, her sense of who she was supposed to be. And in losing all of that, she found something she had not known she was searching for. She found strength in places that looked like hardship. She found beauty in landscapes that seemed only harsh. She found love in the last place she expected, with a man she had been certain she could never care for. John Thornton, self-made and stern, learned that strength does not mean refusing all softness, that discipline does not require cruelty, that a man can be both hard and tender, both demanding and compassionate. He learned that power is not diminished by sharing it, that listening is not weakness, that opening his heart to love did not make him fragile but made him more fully human. Together, they built something neither could have created alone. Not just a business, not just a marriage, but a way of living that honored both principle and compassion, both economic reality and human dignity. They did not solve all the problems of industrial England. They did not erase the divisions between master and worker, between north and south, between wealth and poverty. But within their sphere, they proved that another way was possible. That understanding could bridge what seemed like unbridgeable gaps. That people from different worlds could meet in the middle and find common ground. This story began with division, between regions, between classes, between two people who seemed designed to clash. And it ends with union, with the slow, difficult, necessary work of building connections across those divides. Margaret and John's journey shows us that transformation is painful, that growth requires us to let go of our certainties, that real love is earned through conflict and misunderstanding, and the humility to admit when we are wrong. The North and the South are not opposites, this story tells us. They are parts of the same whole, different faces of the same country, each with its own beauty and its own harshness. Industry and nature, tradition and progress, gentility and labor. These are not contradictions but complements, each needing the other to create something complete. And perhaps that is true of all the divisions we construct. Between rich and poor, between different ways of living, between people who seem to have nothing in common. Perhaps all these divisions are illusions, or at least not as absolute as we believe. Perhaps if we have the courage to cross them, to truly see and listen to those who seem different from us, we will find that we are not so different after all. That beneath the surface distinctions, we are all human, all struggling, all hoping for something better. Margaret learned this truth through grief and loss and the shattering of every certainty she held. It was not an easy lesson. It cost her dearly. But in the end, she emerged stronger, wiser, more capable of love than the girl from Hellstone who thought she knew everything could ever have been. And John, who had built walls around his heart to survive, who had made himself hard to make himself strong, learned that those walls were also prisons. That letting them down was terrifying but necessary. That Margaret's love, earned and real and tested, was worth more than all the success and respect he had worked so hard to achieve. As we leave them, they are standing together at the mill, watching workers stream out at the end of another day. The sun is setting behind the chimneys, painting the smoke gold and rose. Children are playing in the streets. Women are calling families home to supper. The machinery has fallen silent for the night, and Milton is settling into its evening rhythms. It is not a perfect world. The struggles continue. The tensions between masters and workers remain. The economic forces that govern their lives are as relentless as ever, but there is also hope here. There is also change, slow and hard won, but real. There is also love, demonstrated not through grand gestures, but through daily choices, through the decision to listen rather than command, to understand rather than judge, to see each other truly rather than through the filter of prejudice and assumption. Margaret thinks sometimes of Hellstone, of the girl she used to be, of the life she thought she wanted. And she feels a gentle sadness for what was lost, but she does not wish to go back. That life was beautiful but small, constrained by unexamined assumptions and comfortable certainties. This life, difficult, demanding, complicated, is larger. It has stretched her, challenged her, forced her to become more than she was. This life has given her John, and John has given her partnership, respect, the fierce devotion of a man who knows his own worth and recognizes hers as equal. Their marriage is not always easy. They still argue, still clash when their different temperaments and perspectives collide. But they have learned to argue honestly, to fight fair, to always come back to the bedrock truth that they love each other and choose each other, despite and because of their differences. In the quiet of this evening, as the industrial town softens in the fading light, Margaret and John walk home together. They talk about the mill, about the workers, about plans for the future. They talk about everything and nothing. And in the spaces between words, there is comfort, there is trust, there is the deep peace of two people who have found, against all odds, exactly where they belong. Sleep now, dear listener. Let Margaret and John's journey settle into your dreams like a story told by firelight. Let their transformation remind you that change, however painful, can lead us to places more beautiful than we imagined. That the things we resist often hold what we most need. That love is not found in comfort and ease, but in honest struggle, in mutual respect, in the courage to cross the divides that separate us. Tomorrow there will be other stories, other journeys. But tonight, rest in the knowledge that even the harshest landscapes can hold unexpected beauty, that even the most unlikely people can find their way to each other. That understanding, when earned through hardship and humility, is stronger than any easy affection. North and South have met and merged in Margaret and John's love. Industry and compassion have learned to coexist. Two proud, stubborn, passionate people have found a way to be partners, to build something together that honors both their strengths. And perhaps, in your own life, you will find the same truth, that the people who challenge you can teach you most, that the places that feel foreign can become home, that the divisions you think are absolute can be bridged, if you have courage and honesty and the willingness to be changed by what you discover on the other side. Sleep now. Let the smoke clear from the air. Let the machinery fall silent. Let the struggles and conflicts fade into the background, and dream of walking through twilit streets toward a home that was earned, toward a love that was tested and proven, toward a life that is real and complicated and deeply, profoundly worth living. Good night, dear friend. May you find your own way across whatever divides separate you from what you seek. May you have the courage to cross them, and may you find on the other side something as true and beautiful as Margaret and John found in each other. Sweet dreams.